It was raining the night the note appeared on my window. Not the kind of rain that soothes or whispers, but the kind that pounds like it's trying to remind you who's in charge. Sheets of water blurred the street outside, smearing the neon signs of the dive bar across the way into a sickly rainbow. I didn't see it at first. I was halfway through reheating a slice of pizza in my tiny apartment kitchen when something tugged at my attention. Just a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. The window, a dark shape pressed against the glass. I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the counter. The rain distorted the outline, turning it into something amorphous and writhing. Slowly, I approached, my pulse ticking faster with each step. It wasn't a face or a hand or anything as horrifying as my imagination had conjured in those 3 seconds. It was just a piece of paper plastered to the window by the rain, the edges curling and wet. I opened the window just wide enough to peel it off, the paper sticking to my fingers. It was soaked, the ink bleeding into the fibers like veins. But the words were still legible, written in sharp, hurried strokes. Turn around. Do not let them know you saw this. I read it 3 times before the meaning really sank in. Then, without thinking, I turned around. The room was empty. At least, it looked empty. My kitchen table was still cluttered with unopened mail and yesterday's coffee cup. The sofa, sagging in the middle from too many years of abuse, sat where it always had, facing the flickering glow of the muted television. The rain beat against the roof, the only sound apart from my breathing. But it didn't feel empty. Something was off. A prickle ran down the back of my neck, the kind of feeling you get when you know someone's watching you. I backed toward the window, my fingers tightening around the damp note. "Hello," I called, my voice shakier than I intended. The reply was silence. Heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stared into the shadows pooling in the corners of the room, willing my eyes to find something that wasn't there. And then, slowly, the shadows moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the rain, the way it refracted light and made the world shimmer. But no, these shadows were deliberate, stretching and unfurling, long fingers reaching across the walls like ink spilling in reverse. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The only thing I could do was clutch the note tighter, the wet paper cold and crumpled in my fist. The shadows coalesced into a shape. Not human, exactly, but not entirely alien either. A tall, angular form, its head cocked at a strange angle, like it was studying me. The rain-streaked light from the window barely touched it, as though the shadows refused to let go. I stepped back, my calves hitting the edge of the counter. The note's words burned in my mind. Do not let them know you saw this. Too late. The thing tilted its head further, impossibly far now, and I felt a pressure in my ears, like the air itself was trying to crush me. Its limbs twitched, jerking forward in sharp, unnatural movements. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat. Why, I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you here?" The thing didn't answer, not in words. But the room changed. The air thickened, the walls warping and bending like I was underwater. My surroundings melted away, replaced by something vast and cold, a void, endless and starless. And in that void I saw them, countless shapes, just like the one in my kitchen, stretching across the darkness like constellations. Watching, waiting, their forms flickered and shifted, never staying solid for more than a heartbeat. My chest tightened as their presence pressed down on me, an impossible weight that made my head swim. The thing in front of me moved closer. Its mouth, if that's what it was, opened, revealing a jagged, gaping void that sucked in the air around it. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Then, as if it had heard my thoughts, it stopped. Its head tilted back to its original position, and for a moment, the pressure eased. The void behind it began to recede, and the warped edges of my kitchen started to reappear. But as I stood there, trembling, I noticed something. The note in my hand was dry now, the ink clearer than before. New words had appeared, written over the original warning in a sharper, darker hand. "You looked You will hear them. You will see them. And when you do, they will see you too. The shadow moved once more, this time retreating. It flowed back into the corners of the room, disappearing like smoke sucked into a vent. The light returned, and the air felt lighter, but not clean. Never clean. I dropped the note, staring at the crumpled paper on the floor like it might start moving on its own. Murphy crept back into the room, his fur still bristling, and pressed himself against my leg. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. The rain stopped, but the air in my apartment stayed thick, oppressive. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw them in the void, shifting and waiting, as if they'd been there all along. It's been a week now. The note is gone. I burned it the next day, watching the flames consume the words, hoping that might help. It didn't. The shadows in the corners aren't moving anymore, but I can feel them watching, just out of sight. Last night, I woke up to a sound. A knock. Not at the door, but at the window. I didn't look. I won't. But the whispering has started, soft and distant, just on the edge of hearing. And I know that one day, I'll hear them clearly. And when I do, they'll see me again. Let's start a new story. I had just moved into my new apartment, a third-floor walk-up in a historic brick building downtown. The landlord had called it charming, which, as I soon realized, was code for cramped, poorly insulated, and filled with the groans of decades-old plumbing. But it was affordable, and the exposed brick walls and wide windows had convinced me it could feel like home. The sound began on my second night, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on a hollow surface. At first, I thought it was my upstairs neighbor, maybe someone pacing or moving furniture. It wasn't constant, just occasional bursts, always at night when the world outside had quieted enough for me to notice. I didn't think much of it at first. Old buildings make noise. But then I noticed the pattern. The tapping wasn't random. It came in sets of threes, followed by silence, and then another set of threes. Always three. It wasn't loud enough to be disruptive, but it was persistent. By the fourth night, it was driving me crazy. I couldn't locate the source. I pressed my ear to the walls, to the floor, even to the radiator, but the sound never seemed to come from the same place twice. One moment it was above me, the next it was behind me. On the fifth night, I decided to ask my neighbors. The woman across the hall, Mrs. Collier, was in her 60s and always smelled faintly of lavender. When I asked if she'd heard the tapping, her face paled, and she shook her head too quickly. "No," she said, her voice tight. "I don't hear anything." She stepped back into her apartment and closed the door firmly, leaving me standing there, confused. The man in the unit below mine, a software developer named Josh, shrugged when I asked him. "I've got noise-canceling headphones on most of the time," he said. "But hey, old building, right? Probably just pipes." His response was casual, but his eyes darted toward the stairs when I mentioned the tapping, like he was eager to leave the conversation. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I stayed up, determined to record the sound. I set up my phone on the windowsill and hit record, letting it run while I tried to sleep. The tapping started around 2 a.m., as it always did, soft but distinct. 3 taps. Pause. 3 more. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, counting each set until I finally drifted off. The next morning, I checked the recording. The sound was there, faint but clear, 3 taps, over and over. But as I scrubbed through the audio, I heard something else. A whisper. It was so quiet I almost missed it. I played the section again, increasing the volume, and my skin crawled. The whisper was faint but deliberate, a single word repeated in time with the tapping. Downstairs. I stared at my phone, my breath caught in my throat. It had to be some kind of interference, a trick of the building's acoustics. But the word echoed in my mind. I glanced at the floor, suddenly uneasy. By nightfall, the tapping seemed louder. No matter where I moved in the apartment, it followed me, always in sets of 3. I couldn't concentrate on anything. I couldn't eat. By midnight, I'd had enough. I threw on a sweatshirt, grabbed my phone, and headed downstairs. The stairwell was cold and dimly lit, the kind of place where every creak of the wooden steps felt exaggerated. I reached the first floor, half expecting to find, I don't know, something, someone. But the hallway was empty, and the front door was locked tight. Then I noticed the basement door. I'd seen it before, tucked at the end of the hall, but it had always been locked. Tonight, it was ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. A faint draft seeped through the gap, carrying with it a smell that made my stomach churn, earthy and damp like rotting leaves. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The word echoed faintly, unanswered. I should have turned back. I should have gone upstairs, packed my things, and never looked back. But something pulled me forward. The tapping had stopped. For the first time in days, the apartment was silent, and that silence felt worse than the noise. I pushed the door open and stared down the narrow staircase. The steps were concrete, chipped and uneven, leading into shadows so thick my phone's flashlight barely penetrated them. The smell grew stronger as I descended, each step heavier than the last. At the bottom, the basement stretched out like a cavern, dimly lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were damp, streaked with grime, and the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, scraps of fabric, unidentifiable junk. And then I saw it. In the center of the room was a chair, old wooden, its paint peeling, and on the floor around it, a perfect circle of scattered objects. Buttons, coins, shards of glass. The arrangement was meticulous, deliberate. I stepped closer, the air thick and suffocating. The tapping returned, louder now, echoing from the walls. My phone's flashlight flickered, and in its brief strobe, I saw something I can't explain. A figure seated in the chair. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. Its limbs were impossibly long, its skin stretched tight over jagged bones. Its head hung low, and its face there was no face. Just smooth, featureless flesh. The tapping stopped as it slowly raised its head. My scream caught in my throat as it stood, unfolding like a grotesque marionette. The air around it seemed to ripple, a distortion that made my vision blur. I stumbled back, tripping over debris, my phone clattering to the ground. Downstairs, it whispered, though its mouth never moved. I don't remember running back up the stairs. I don't remember locking my apartment door behind me. But I remember the sound that followed me all night. 3 soft taps coming from inside my closet. I left the apartment the next morning without looking back. My things are still there, probably gathering dust, but I don't care. Sometimes, though, in the dead of night, I still hear it. 3 taps, faint and rhythmic. Wherever I go, it finds me, and every time, it whispers the same thing. Downstairs. Let's start a new story. I've never been much of a gambler. My dad used to say that chance is the tax you pay for hope, and hope's a bad account. But last Friday, on my way home from a late-night shift, I saw something that made me reconsider all my rules. It was an old vending machine, tucked away in the corner of a rundown gas station. The kind of thing you'd think they stopped making decades ago. Scratched up metal, yellowing plastic panels, and a flickering sign above it that read the game of chance. What drew me in wasn't the machine itself. It was the card taped to the front, written in a looping, ornate hand. 1 token per play. Guaranteed prize every time. Take a chance. Change your life. I almost laughed. It sounded like something you'd hear in a cheesy infomercial. But the station clerk was asleep at the counter. The air outside was biting cold, and I had time to kill while waiting for my rideshare. So, against my better judgment, I fished a coin out of my pocket and slid it into the slot. The machine whirred to life with an odd, mechanical cough, the kind of sound you'd expect from something ancient being forced to work. The screen in front of me lit up, showing a row of spinning symbols, a red apple, a golden bell, a green $sign, a clock, and something that looked like a key. They spun so fast that they blurred into a rainbow of colors. Then one by one they stopped. Clock, key, 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 clock. A low chime sounded, softer than I expected but oddly pleasant, like the machine itself was satisfied with my play. A slot opened at the bottom, and out slid a small black envelope. I stared at it, caught off guard. No cheap plastic toy or stale candy bar, just this plain envelope. I picked it up and slid my finger under the seal. Inside was a card, blank except for 2 words printed in clean, serif font. Tomorrow. 3:17 p.m. I frowned, flipping the card over. Nothing on the back. No explanación. No instructions. I turned to the clerk, still slumped over his counter, snoring faintly, and debated waking him up to ask about the machine. But something stopped me. Call it curiosity or the tingle of something deeper, an itch beneath the skin of normalcy. When my ride finally arrived, I tucked the envelope into my jacket pocket and told myself it was just a weird gimmick. But the next day, at exactly 3:17 p.m., I learned it wasn't. I was walking through the park near my apartment, earbuds in, music drowning out the hum of the world. The sidewalks were slick from a morning rain, and the air smelled like damp earth. Then, just as my playlist skipped to the next track, a runner passed me. A woman in a blue hoodie, her ponytail swaying as her feet slapped against the pavement. Nothing unusual, except for the way she glanced back at me. Just a quick look over her shoulder, her face tense. And then she tripped. I stopped, pulling out my earbuds as she hit the ground hard. She rolled on her back, groaning, clutching her ankle. "Hey, are you okay?" I called, jogging over. "Fine," she muttered, wincing as she tried to sit up. Just my shoe caught on the curb." I reached out to help her, and that's when I saw it. Her hoodie had shifted just enough to reveal a key dangling from her neck. Not just any key. The same one from the vending machine. Its shape was unmistakable, with its looping bow and jagged teeth. It glinted in the light as if it were laughing at me. "Where did you get that?" I asked before I could stop myself. Her eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "That key," I said, pointing at it. It looks familiar." She hesitated, her hand reflexively gripping the chain. "It's just a key." "Why?" But she didn't finish her sentence. Her gaze flicked to something behind me, her face draining of color. I turned to look, and my breath caught in my throat. The man was standing across the street. Tall, thin, dressed in an old-fashioned suit that looked more like it belonged in the 1920s than today. His face was pale, angular, with dark eyes that seemed to drink in the world around him. He wasn't moving, just watching. And in his hand was a second key, identical to the one the woman wore. "Who is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, backing away instinctively. The man smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a chill racing down my spine. Then, as a car passed between us, he vanished. The woman bolted. She limped a few steps before finding her stride, disappearing down the path without another word. I stood there, frozen, the sound of her retreating footsteps fading into the distance. That night, I went back to the gas station. The machine was still there, its sign flickering weakly in the dark. But when I stepped closer, I saw something that hadn't been there before. Another card taped to the front. "One token per play. Take a chance. Choose your future." I stared at it, my heart pounding. I should have walked away. I should have let it go. But my hand reached for my pocket, where I'd tucked another coin earlier that day. My fingers trembled as I slid it into the slot. This time, the symbols on the screen spun faster, a kaleidoscope of images that made my head ache. They stopped abruptly, one after the other. Bell, apple, clock, key, blank. The machine shuddered, its mechanical innards groaning, and the slot at the bottom opened again. A new envelope slid out, this one red instead of black. I picked it up with shaking hands, tore it open, and pulled out the card inside. 3 words stared back at me, stark and unrelenting. "Do not run." The lights in the gas station flickered. The clerk was gone, and when I turned around, he was there, the man in the suit, closer this time, smiling. The card in my hand began to heat up, the letters shifting like they were alive. I dropped it, and as it hit the ground, the words rearranged themselves into something new. "Your turn now." I ran. I don't know how far, how long, but I know one thing. The vending machine is still out there, waiting for its next player. And somewhere behind me, he is too. Let's start a new story. I noticed it on a Monday morning as I stepped into the hallway of my apartment building. A faint metallic tang, sharp and unsettling, hung in the air like a phantom. At first, I thought it might be the plumbing or the heating system. My building was old, and strange odors came and went. But this was different. This clung to my throat, and lingered in the corners of my mind, like something rotten trying to stay hidden. I mentioned it to Mrs. Calloway, my elderly neighbor, as she shuffled by with her ever-present cane. Her pale blue eyes flicked up at me for a brief second before darting away. "Best not to notice things like that," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the clack of her cane on the tiled floor. Before I could ask what she meant, she was already at her door, locking herself inside. The smell didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger, weaving through the air vents and seeping into the walls. By Wednesday, I could taste it. I asked the building super, Tom, if he'd noticed it, but he just shrugged. "Old pipes," he said. "These places always have a smell." But his eyes betrayed him. He wouldn't meet my gaze, and his hands fidgeted with the keys on his belt. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was coming from outside. My bedroom window faced the alley, and stray cats often rummaged through the garbage. But as I lay in bed, holding my breath, I realized the sound was too close. It was inside the apartment, faint and rhythmic, like nails dragging across wood. I crept out of bed, my heart pounding in my ears, and followed the sound to the kitchen. It stopped the moment I flicked on the light. The air was colder there, the metallic smell so strong it made my eyes water. The window above the sink was closed and locked, and nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time Friday came, I was beginning to feel like I was losing my mind. The smell had saturated everything. My clothes, my furniture, even the pages of the book I was reading. The scratching came and went, always in the dead of night, always just quiet enough to make me doubt I'd heard it at all. And then there were the whispers. They started faint, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, barely audible over the hum of my refrigerator. But over time, they grew louder, distinct enough that I could make out fragments of words. Not in English, not in any language I recognized. I called my sister that evening. "I think there's something wrong with this building," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's not just the smell. It's other things. Noises. Whispers. I can't explain it." "You've been stressed," she said gently. "You're probably imagining it. Get some sleep." But I knew I wasn't imagining it. Not anymore. That night, I dreamed of a hole. It was wide and jagged, carved into the floor of my kitchen, as though something had chewed through the tiles and the concrete beneath. I stood at the edge, peering down into the darkness, and heard the whispers rising from below, louder now, almost a chant. My legs trembled as I leaned forward, trying to see how deep it went, when something in the blackness shifted. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was wrong, twisted limbs, too many joints, eyes like smoldering coals, and it was climbing. I woke drenched in sweat, my sheets tangled around me. The kitchen light was on. I knew I'd turn it off before bed. I didn't move at first, barely daring to breathe. Then I heard it, a soft thump like something heavy dropping to the floor. It came from the kitchen. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron skillet, and crept toward the sound. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the fridge, but the smell was overwhelming now, so thick it felt like it was clogging my lungs. When I reached the kitchen, I froze. The floor was wet, a thin, dark liquid pooling across the tiles. The cabinet under the sink hung open, and something pale peeked out from the shadows inside. It looked like a hand. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. And then it moved. The fingers twitched, curling inward, the joints bending too far in the wrong directions. A noise escaped me, half gasp, half scream, and I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing barefoot on the sidewalk in my pajamas. The city buzzed around me, indifferent to my panic. I stood there for hours, watching the window of my apartment, half expecting to see something staring back at me. But it stayed dark. By morning, I convinced myself to go back. I couldn't leave everything behind without knowing what was happening. I climbed the stairs slowly, gripping the railing like it might hold me back if I decided to turn and run. When I reached my door, I saw it immediately. The smell was gone. So was the dark liquid. But the handprint remained. It was smeared across the door in streaks of something black and oily, the shape impossibly large, with too many fingers. I didn't go inside. I left everything I owned in that apartment and never looked back. I tried to warn the new tenants when I saw the moving truck outside a month later. But when I approached them, they only smiled politely and told me they'd heard no strange noises, smelled nothing unusual. "It's been fine," the husband said, though his smile seemed strained. 2 weeks ago, I passed the building on my way home from work. The windows of my old apartment were dark, the curtains drawn. And yet, as I stood there on the sidewalk, I could swear I saw a faint movement in the shadows, something large pressing up against the glass, watching. Let's start a new story. It started with a postcard, one of those generic touristy ones with a glossy picture of a lighthouse on the front. It wasn't addressed to me or to us. It was addressed to her. I found it in the kitchen, sitting on the counter among the pile of mail she never bothered to open. She walked past it a dozen times before I asked, "Who's it from?" Maya looked up from her tea, her expression as unreadable as ever. "Oh, just a friend from college," she said casually, barely glancing at the card. I turned it over. The handwriting was neat, precise, the kind you'd expect from someone who still sent postcards. No name, just a brief message. "Thinking of you. Miss our talks. D." "Who's D?" I asked, as lightly as I could manage. Her laugh was quick, dismissive. "An old study partner. We used to joke about running away to Maine to live by a lighthouse. You know how silly college dreams are." She poured more tea and changed the subject, but the postcard stayed on the counter. I caught her looking at it later, her fingers brushing the edges as if it were made of something delicate. I didn't think much of it at first. Everyone has their own past, after all. But then other little things started to show up, breadcrumbs I wasn't meant to follow. A forgotten scarf draped over the passenger seat of her car, faintly smelling of cologne. Her sudden interest in handwritten letters when she'd always been a send it by text kind of person. The way she'd smile at her phone, not the way she used to smile at cat memes, but like she was reading something private, intimate. Maya wasn't the type to leave clues on purpose, but she wasn't careful either. One evening, I found a ticket stub tucked into the pages of a novel she'd been reading. A museum in a city she hadn't mentioned visiting. She said it was from a work trip that she'd gone there during her lunch break, but the stub was for an exhibit that opened at 6 p.m. "You're overthinking," I told myself. But the pieces were falling together, one by one, and it was hard to ignore the shape they made. The tipping point came on a Sunday. We were supposed to meet friends for brunch, but Maya said she wasn't feeling well. She stayed home, wrapped in a blanket on the couch, and I went alone. When I returned, the apartment was empty. The blanket was folded neatly, her tea mug washed and drying on the rack. Her car wasn't in the driveway. She came back hours later, carrying groceries. She smiled at me like nothing was wrong, but there was a faint flush to her cheeks, a tiredness in her eyes that didn't match the energy of a quick trip to the store. "Where were you?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. She froze for a split second, then shrugged. "Just out. Needed some air." The next morning, I made an excuse to work from home. After she left, I spent the day replaying every strange moment, every inconsistency, trying to piece together the parts of her life I no longer fit into. Then I saw it, the postcard still on the counter. I turned it over, looking at the handwriting again. Precise. Familiar. I walked to the desk where she kept her stationery, the drawer that always stuck just a little when you opened it. Inside were notebooks, envelopes, pens, and a pile of letters tied with twine. They weren't hidden, not really, but they were buried beneath enough clutter to suggest she didn't want them found. The letters were from D, postmarked from different places, their tone growing more intimate with each page. "I wish you could have seen the sunrise this morning. I'm counting the days until you visit." And then the one that made my chest tighten. "It's hard, sharing you with someone else, but I'll wait as long as you need." I put the letters back exactly as I'd found them and closed the drawer. My hands were shaking, but I didn't feel angry. Not yet. Just hollow. I sat on the couch for hours, staring at the postcard, wondering how long it had been going on, wondering if it had started as a joke, the way she claimed, or if this D had always been waiting in the wings. That night, Maya came home smiling, her face glowing from the cold air outside. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day. I didn't bring up the letters. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I waited until the weekend. She said she was visiting her sister, an excuse so perfectly crafted that I almost believed it. I followed her car, keeping a careful distance. She didn't drive toward her sister's place. She drove 3 hours out of town to a small coastal city I'd never been to. I watched from my car as she parked outside a cafe, stepped out, and was greeted by a man who pulled her into an embrace that lasted too long to be friendly. He had sandy blonde hair and a scruffy beard, the kind of look that made him seem effortlessly interesting. They went inside, and I didn't follow. I didn't need to. I waited until she came home that evening, still wearing the same clothes, her cheeks flushed with that same unmistakable energy. She kissed me again, but I pulled away. "Maya," I said. "Who's Dee?" Her face went pale. For the first time in 7 years, she didn't have an answer. I packed a bag that night. She cried, said she was sorry, that she'd been confused, but I didn't stay to hear the rest. Some betrayals don't need an explanation. Some betrayals are loud enough to speak for themselves. Let's start a new story. I didn't think much of it at first. A faint floral smell wafted through my apartment one night as I sat reading on the couch. My windows were shut, the vents hadn't been on in weeks, and there were no lilies in my home, fresh, artificial, or otherwise. It was so faint, I convinced myself I was imagining it. But the next night, it returned stronger, hanging in the air like invisible fog. Sweet and cloying, it felt alive in a way that made my stomach churn. I checked everywhere. The garbage, the cupboards, my sink. Nothing. I even crawled around the living room, nose nearly pressed to the carpet, trying to pinpoint the source. But there wasn't one. The smell simply existed, lingering long after it should have dissipated. By the third night, the scent was so overwhelming it woke me from a dead sleep. It felt invasive, clinging to the walls, my clothes, even my skin. I spent hours scrubbing every surface of my apartment with vinegar and baking soda, desperate to drown it out. But it didn't work. Instead, the smell grew worse. A rancid undercurrent twisted through the sweetness, like something decaying beneath a mask of perfume. That was when the lilies began to appear. The first one was on my windowsill, stark white against the black glass. I found it the morning after the cleaning spree, the petals perfectly arranged, still glistening with dew. My heart sank. My windows had been locked. I lived on the 4th floor. No one could have left it there. I threw it out, slamming the lid on the garbage can with more force than necessary. But the next morning, there were 2 lilies. One on the bathroom sink, its reflection caught in the mirror, and the other balanced precariously on my desk chair. Over the next few days, they multiplied. Lilies appeared on my pillow, the edge of the bathtub, my bookshelf. By the end of the week, they had completely overtaken the apartment. Their presence was suffocating, their scent now so strong it blurred my vision and left me gasping for air. I called my landlord, desperate for an explanation, but he dismissed me with a laugh. "Lilies? Maybe you're being courted by a secret admirer," he joked. When I pressed him further, his tone changed. "You're the first tenant in years." The place was empty for a long time, after the incident. I begged him to elaborate, but he brushed me off, muttering something about paperwork before hanging up. That night, I slept in my car. When I returned the next morning, the lilies were gone. The air was clear, as if nothing had ever happened. My relief was short-lived. As I walked through the apartment, I noticed something else, scratches on the walls. Fine, shallow marks, almost like claw marks, gouged into the paint. They weren't random. They formed patterns. At first, I thought they were shapes. A flower, maybe? A lily? But the longer I stared, the clearer the message became. "You're invited." I left. I should have stayed gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wasn't enough. There was a gravity to the message, a weight that pulled at my thoughts even as I tried to ignore it. By nightfall, I found myself back at the apartment, driven by a mix of dread and curiosity. The lilies were back, but this time, they weren't scattered randomly. They were arranged in a trail leading from the door to the bedroom. I followed them. In the bedroom, the lilies formed a ring on the floor, their petals glowing faintly in the dim light. In the center of the ring lay something I couldn't immediately comprehend. It looked like a mirror at first, a flat, black surface reflecting nothing. But when I stepped closer, it began to ripple, as if liquid. A faint voice echoed from it, soft and melodic, but too far away to understand. It was beautiful and terrible all at once, and it filled me with a longing I couldn't explain. The surface began to shift, shapes forming within the darkness. A hand reached out. It wasn't human. The fingers were impossibly long, delicate, and bone-white, as if carved from porcelain. They grasped the edge of the blackness, pulling the rest of the form into view. A face, pale and featureless except for two hollow indentations where eyes should have been. The head tilted, observing me, and the voice grew louder, words spilling into my mind in a language I didn't understand but somehow felt deeply familiar. "Come," it said. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground as the figure continued to rise, pulling its emaciated frame from the void. Its body seemed too fragile to hold itself together, yet it moved with fluid grace. Lilies bloomed in its wake, sprouting from the floor in impossibly fast bursts, their petals curling toward it like they were reaching for a god. I wanted to run, but the air pressed down on me, thick and heavy, until I could barely breathe. The figure extended a hand toward me, its fingers curling in a gesture that could only mean one thing: follow. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but I bolted, tearing out of the apartment and down the stairs, the smell of lilies burning in my nose the entire way. I didn't stop running until I reached a hotel on the other side of the city. I never went back. I didn't even bother breaking the lease. I left everything behind: furniture, clothes, even my wallet. But it doesn't matter. The lilies followed me. They started small, a single bloom on my motel pillow, a faint floral scent trailing me as I walked to work. Now they're everywhere again, spilling out of the cracks in the walls, blooming in the corners of my vision no matter where I look. Last night, I woke to find a single message scratched into the headboard of the motel bed. "You should have come. The lilies are singing now." Their melody is soft, almost comforting. And in the corner of the room, something is waiting, its pale fingers tapping a rhythm against the wall. Let's start a new story. The first time I heard the sound, I thought it was just the pipes. My apartment was old, a pre-war building with creaky floors and walls so thin I could hear my upstairs neighbor sneezing. Strange noises were part of the charm, or so the landlord claimed when I signed the lease. But this sound wasn't the groan of old plumbing or the distant hum of someone's TV. It was a low, rhythmic tapping, faint but deliberate, coming from the vent in my bedroom wall. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone when it started. Top, top, top. A perfect, even rhythm, like a metronome. I ignored it at first, figuring it would stop on its own, but it didn't. By the third night, the tapping had become an obsession. It always started at exactly 11:13 p.m. and lasted for 15 minutes. Never a second more, never a second less. It wasn't loud, but it was insistent, like a knock at a door that only I could hear. I tried everything to block it out: earplugs, white noise machines, even music blasted through my headphones. But no matter what I did, the sound found its way through. Top, top, top. It wasn't until the fifth night that I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a screwdriver, I unscrewed the vent cover and peered inside. The duct was dark and narrow, stretching deep into the walls of the building. Nothing moved. No signs of pests or loose debris. Just cold, stale air. I was about to close it back up when something caught my eye, a faint glint deeper in the duct. I reached in, my fingers brushing against the cold metal walls, until I felt something smooth and cool. When I pulled it out, I found myself holding an old key. It was small and ornate, its handle shaped like a twisting vine. I turned it over in my hand, trying to make sense of how it had gotten there, when I noticed something etched into the base. Room 6. There was no room 6 in my building. My apartment was 3B, and there were only 4 floors. Confused, I slid the key into my pocket and tried to put it out of my mind. But the tapping didn't stop. That night, it started again, louder than before. This time, it wasn't coming from the vent. It was coming from my closet. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. Slowly, I got up and crossed the room, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. The tapping stopped the moment I touched it. Inside, everything was as I'd left it. Clothes hung neatly on their hangers, shoes lined up in rows. But the air was different, heavier, colder, like the breath of an open freezer. And then I saw it. At the back of the closet, where there should have been nothing but drywall, there was a door. It was small, barely tall enough for me to crawl through, and made of dark wood with a tarnished brass handle. I could have sworn it hadn't been there before. My heart pounded as I knelt down and tried the handle. Locked. I stared at it for a long moment before I remembered the key in my pocket. It slid into the lock smoothly, the mechanism clicking with a satisfying finality. I hesitated. Every instinct I had screamed to stop, to leave it alone, to walk away. But the same pull that had drawn me to the vent now urged me forward. I turned the handle and opened the door. Beyond it was a tunnel, its walls made of the same dark wood as the door. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic. I crawled inside, the space so narrow that my shoulders brushed against the walls. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. I tried to keep track of the direction, but it was impossible. Every time I thought I'd gone straight, I'd find myself turning again. And then, without warning, the tunnel opened up into a room. It was small, barely larger than my bedroom, with walls covered in peeling wallpaper that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow glow over the space. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a tape recorder. I approached it cautiously, half expecting it to spring to life on its own. But it didn't. It just sat there, silent and unassuming. I pressed play. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, a voice began to emerge, warped and distorted like an old radio transmission. "Do you hear it?" the voice whispered. The static crackled, and the voice grew louder. "Do you feel it?" My blood ran cold. "It's watching you." The tape clicked off. Before I could react, the light bulb flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to scan the room. But the walls were no longer wooden. They were stone, cold and rough beneath my fingers. And the door I'd come through? Gone. That's when I heard it. The tapping. It wasn't faint anymore. It was loud and echoing, bouncing off the stone walls like a drumbeat. Talp, talp, talp. It was coming closer. I backed away, my flashlight shaking as the tapping grew louder, more frantic. And then, from the corner of the room, something moved. It was a shape tall and angular, its limbs too long and its movements too jerky to be human. Its head tilted, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze lock onto me. I ran. The tunnel was different now, narrower and steeper, the walls closing in around me. The air grew colder with every step, the tapping following me, relentless and deafening. When I finally burst out of the closet and into my bedroom, the tapping stopped. The door was gone, the key was gone, but the sound? The sound stayed with me. Let's start a new story. I never liked elevators. Something about the way they hum and groan unsettles me. I've always preferred stairs, but when you're on the 42nd floor of a massive office building, the elevator isn't exactly optional. At least, that's what I told myself the day it all happened. It was a late Friday evening, and I'd stayed behind to finish a report my boss needed first thing Monday. The office was deserted, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights to keep me company. By the time I finally saved the document and powered down my computer, the clock on the wall read 9:47 p.m. I sighed, packed my bag, and headed toward the elevators. The corridor was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that gets under your skin. The elevators were at the far end, past a row of glass offices that reflected the dim emergency lights in a distorted, unsettling way. I pressed the call button, and the ding of the arriving elevator echoed louder than it should have in the empty space. The doors slid open, revealing the usual sterile, mirrored interior. I stepped inside, hit the button for the lobby, and leaned against the wall, waiting for the ride down. The doors closed, and the elevator began its descent with a faint lurch. I remember watching the floor numbers blink in descending order. 41, 40, 39. And then, without warning, the elevator stopped. Just stopped. No shudder, no flicker of lights. Just a complete, eerie stillness. I stared at the panel, confused. The floor indicator read 38, but the elevator wasn't moving. I pressed the button for the lobby again. Nothing. Tried the door open button. Still nothing. My stomach churned as I jabbed at the emergency call button. A distant, crackling tone buzzed through the speaker, but no one answered. The intercom wasn't working. Great. I told myself not to panic. It was probably just a minor malfunction. Someone would notice the elevator was stuck soon enough, right? I pulled out my phone, but the signal was dead. Typical. That's when the hum started. It was faint at first, a low vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't the kind of mechanical hum you'd expect from an elevator. It felt alive somehow, like the sound was searching for something or someone. Hello? I called out instinctively, my voice sounding small and fragile in the enclosed space. The hum grew louder, deeper, almost melodic, like a single, resonant note being dragged out for far too long. And then the lights flickered. Once, twice. On the third flicker, they went out completely, plunging the elevator into suffocating darkness. I stood there, frozen, my breath loud in my ears. I reached for my phone, using the screen's dim glow to light the space around me. The mirrored walls reflected my face back at me, pale and wide-eyed, over and over again. That's when I noticed it. The reflection directly across from me was wrong. It wasn't mirroring me. It was just standing there. It looked like me. Same clothes, same bag slung over one shoulder. But its head was tilted slightly, its lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. I stared at it, my chest tightening, my legs trembling. Slowly, I raised my hand, and the reflection didn't move. It just kept staring, its unblinking eyes boring into mine. No, I whispered, my voice cracking. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping my phone like a lifeline, and when I opened them again, the reflection was gone. My real reflection had returned, mirroring my every move. But something had changed. The hum had stopped, and the elevator was moving again. Relief washed over me as the lights flickered back to life. The floor indicator blinked. 37, 36, 35. I exhaled shakily, leaning back against the wall, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, fatigue. It had to be. The elevator stopped again at 31. This time, the doors opened. But it wasn't a hallway that greeted me. It was darkness. Not the kind of darkness where you can still make out vague shapes or outlines. This was absolute, void-like, as if the world beyond the doors had simply ceased to exist. My heart pounded as I stared into it, every instinct in my body screaming to press the door close button. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. Then, from the blackness, something moved. At first, it was subtle, a ripple in the void like disturbed water. But then it took shape. A figure stepped forward, barely visible at first, but solidifying with each step. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and its movements unnervingly fluid. Its face, or where a face should have been, was smooth and featureless like polished obsidian. It paused just beyond the threshold, tilting its head as if considering me. And then it stepped inside. The door slid shut behind it. I stumbled backward, pressing myself into the corner of the elevator as the thing stood motionless in the center of the space. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, filling the room with an oppressive, suffocating presence. The air felt thick, heavy, as though it were being sucked out of the room. "WH, what do you want?" I stammered, my voice trembling. It didn't answer, but the hum returned, louder, deeper, vibrating through my bones. The lights began flickering again, casting the thing's silhouette in jarring, strobe-like flashes. And then it turned its head toward me. It didn't have eyes, but I knew it was looking at me. I could feel its gaze like cold fingers on my skin. The elevator jerked violently, snapping me out of my daze. The floor indicator was flashing now, the numbers skipping erratically. 27, 15, 43. The walls seemed to close in, the mirrored panels warping and bending like liquid. My reflection twisted into grotesque, unrecognizable shapes, grinning at me with too many teeth. I screamed. I couldn't help it. I pressed every button on the panel, desperate for something, anything to happen. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The hum, the flickering, the distorted reflections gone. The elevator dinged softly, and the doors opened. I found myself in the lobby, the warm light of the reception area spilling into the elevator. Everything looked normal, calm, but I didn't step out right away. I couldn't. My legs felt like jelly, and my brain was still struggling to process what had just happened. Finally, I forced myself to move, stumbling into the lobby like a drunkard. The security guard at the front desk looked up, startled. "Are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing. I opened my mouth to respond, but then I froze. Behind him, reflected in the glass doors of the building, was the elevator. Its doors were still open, and inside, something was watching me. The featureless face, the impossibly long limbs. It raised one hand, slowly, and waved. The doors slid shut. I don't use elevators anymore. Let's start a new story. It started with a voicemail. Not the kind you expect. No reminder from a dentist, no missed call from a friend. Just a voicemail that appeared on my phone with no associated number, timestamp, or call log. It was as if it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. I didn't even realize it was there until days after it appeared. I was scrolling through my voicemail inbox, clearing old messages, when I saw it at the very bottom, a message marked unknown sender. My first thought was spam, but something about it felt off, almost like it was humming with a strange energy. Curiosity won out. I pressed play. At first, there was only static. I almost deleted it, but then I heard it, a faint voice, distorted and crackling, like it was being transmitted from miles away. "Hello? Is this working? Can you hear me?" The voice was trembling, desperate. It was mine. I stared at the phone, feeling cold all over. I hadn't left this message. I didn't remember saying those words. The voice on the recording, my voice, continued, breathless and panicked. "You need to listen. You need to leave. Don't." The rest was static. The message ended abruptly. I replayed it 3 more times, trying to make sense of it. The tone was unmistakably mine, but the fear in the voice was something I didn't recognize. It was like hearing a stranger who had learned to mimic me perfectly. I deleted the voicemail. I didn't want it on my phone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the recording played in my head, looping over and over. "You need to leave." Don't what? Leave where? It was probably just some glitch, I told myself, my mind dredging up some forgotten recording of my own voice. A prank, maybe. It didn't mean anything. But the next morning, the message was back. It was at the bottom of my inbox again, marked unknown sender, just as before. Identical. Same static, same voice. Same warning. I deleted it again. Over the next few days, the voicemail kept reappearing, no matter how many times I erased it. Each time, I felt that same creeping unease. But what could I do? Report a ghostly voicemail to tech support? Tell my friends my phone was haunted? And then things escalated. It was a Wednesday night when I first noticed something strange about the apartment. I'd been living there for 6 months without issue. It was a small, 1-bedroom unit in an old building downtown, the kind of place where you could hear your neighbors arguing through the walls but still felt oddly cozy. That night, though, I noticed the kitchen. It was wrong. Not dramatically, just subtly off. The drawers weren't in the right places. The stove looked newer than I remembered. There was a window above the sink that I was sure hadn't been there before. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but as I stood there, the sense of wrongness deepened. I texted my landlord, asking if they'd done renovations recently. The response came quickly. No renovations. Everything should be the same. The voicemail came back that night. This time, the voice on the recording sounded more urgent. "It's changing. You need to go. Don't let it catch up to you." I stared at my phone, my pulse hammering. The static was louder now, drowning out the end of the message. I didn't delete it this time. Over the next few days, the changes in the apartment grew worse. The living room carpet changed color. The shower faucet turned from silver to brass overnight. My bookshelf rearranged itself. At first, I thought I was losing my mind, but then I noticed something else. When I looked away from an object and looked back, it sometimes shifted. A chair would be an inch closer to the table. A picture frame would tilt ever so slightly. It wasn't just the apartment. Outside, familiar landmarks began to feel unfamiliar. The corner store where I bought coffee now had a green awning instead of red. A tree on my street grew taller overnight, its branches scraping my window in the wind. People I passed on the sidewalk seemed to glance at me a second too long, their expressions unreadable. The voicemail started changing, too. Now, when it appeared, the voice was distorted, choppy, barely audible beneath the static. "It's bigger. Not just you. Run." The last word cut through clearly, so sharp it made me flinch. That was the night I saw the cracks. They started small, hairline fractures along the edges of the ceiling, the corners of the walls. At first, I thought they were normal, signs of an old building settling, but the cracks grew. They widened and darkened, spreading like veins. When I tried to touch one, my hand went cold. It wasn't drywall beneath my fingers. It felt like nothing, a void where the wall should have been. I jerked my hand back, my heart racing. That night, I heard the first noise. It came from the kitchen, a low rumble like distant thunder. I crept out of bed, gripping my phone like a weapon, and found the kitchen bathed in flickering light. The fridge door was open, but the interior wasn't a fridge anymore. It was a gaping black hole, impossibly deep. Something moved in the dark. I slammed the fridge shut and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By the next morning, the cracks were everywhere. They lined the walls, the floors, even the ceiling. They pulsed faintly, as if alive. And then, around noon, my phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. "I can't help you anymore," my voice whispered through the static. "It's found me. It's found us." The message dissolved into a horrible noise, a low, guttural growl, followed by a sound like breaking glass. I packed a bag and left the apartment. I didn't even lock the door behind me. But the thing is, I don't think it mattered. I've been staying with friends, crashing on couches, trying to pretend that I'm okay. But every time I close my eyes, I see the cracks. I hear the rumble. And every morning, no matter where I go, the voicemail is waiting. This morning, it said something new. "It's your turn now." Let's start a new story. The first time it happened, I thought it was just exhaustion. It had been a long day at the gallery where I worked, and I was running on 4 hours of sleep and too much coffee. The event, a charity auction featuring obnoxiously expensive art that no one actually cared about, had drained the last bit of energy from me. I was halfway through packing up the last wine glasses when I turned toward the back of the gallery and froze. The painting was wrong. I'd spent all day staring at it. Crimson Migration, a moody piece of abstract swirls that looked like a violent storm frozen in time. But now, instead of the original deep reds and blacks, the canvas was streaked with muted greens and pale yellows, like someone had swapped it out when I wasn't looking. I blinked, my pulse quickening. It had to be the lighting, I told myself. The gallery's overhead fluorescents were notorious for distorting colors late at night. I walked closer to get a better look, but the colors didn't shift. I leaned in, running my fingers along the frame, checking for tampering. The painting felt the same texture, same faint smell of oil paint, but it wasn't. I called my boss, Jen, and told her. She sighed heavily on the other end of the line, clearly annoyed. "You're overthinking it, Chloe. Go home. Get some sleep. We'll deal with it tomorrow." So I did. I went home, collapsed into bed, and dreamed of storms and strange colors swirling together like liquid galaxies. The next morning, the painting was back to normal. For a few days, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Stress, lack of sleep, a trick of my tired brain. I even laughed about it with my coworker Elena, who teased me for hallucinating fine art. But then it happened again. This time, it was the sculpture. It was a piece called Pulse, a sleek steel structure shaped like a spiraling wave, and it was impossible to miss. It stood right in the center of the gallery. I walked past it every day, admiring how the light played off its mirrored surface. But one morning, when I arrived to set up for a new exhibition, it wasn't the same. The spiral was twisted the other way. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but the more I stared, the more certain I became. The curve of the steel was reversed, the ridges warped in a way that made my stomach churn. I grabbed Elena and pointed it out, but she just frowned at me. "What are you talking about? It looks exactly the same." "No, it doesn't. Look at the curve, it's flipped." She squinted at the sculpture, then at me, her face tightening with concern. "Chloe, are you okay? You've been working a lot lately." I wanted to argue, but her expression made me hesitate. "Maybe you're right," I muttered. "I'll take a break." I took 2 days off, spent them sleeping, reading, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that something was off. When I returned, the sculpture was back to its original form. For weeks, the changes became more frequent. A painting would shift, a sculpture would twist, an entire arrangement of furniture would subtly rearrange itself. Sometimes it was small, a pedestal moved an inch to the left, a painting hung at a slightly different angle. Other times, it was dramatic. Colors inverted, textures changed. Even the subjects of certain works altered entirely. No one else seemed to notice. I tried pointing it out to Elena and Jen, but they always dismissed me, their smiles polite but skeptical. Once, when I showed Jen a particularly drastic change, a painting that had transformed from a pastoral landscape into an abstract mess of jagged lines, she patted my shoulder and said, "It's probably a different piece. You're overthinking it." But I wasn't. I started documenting the changes. Every night before I left, I took photos of the gallery, snapping shots of every piece from multiple angles. When I returned in the morning, I compared the photos to what was in front of me. They never matched. The photos always showed the normal versions of the art, but what I saw with my own eyes was different. It was like reality itself was bending, twisting the world around me into something unrecognizable. Then one night I stayed late. I wanted to catch it in the act, to see whatever was causing the changes. I sat in the gallery's corner office, the security monitors glowing in the dim light, watching as the hours ticked by. At first, nothing happened. Midnight passed, then 1, then 2. At 2:17 a.m., the hum started. It was faint at first, a low vibration that seemed to come from the walls. The air grew heavy, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly. I leaned closer to the monitors, my breath catching as I saw it. The sculpture in the center of the gallery was moving. Not shifting, not being physically moved by anyone, it was melting. The steel rippled like liquid mercury, reshaping itself in slow, deliberate waves. Paintings on the walls flickered, their colors bleeding and merging like wet ink. And then the figures appeared. At first, they were just shadows, indistinct shapes flitting across the edges of the cameras. But as I stared, they grew clearer. They were tall, impossibly thin, their limbs too long and their movements jerky, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. One of them turned, and for a moment, I swear it looked directly into the camera. I stumbled back from the monitor, my chest heaving, the hum growing louder. When I looked back, the figures were gone. The gallery was silent and still, as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, when I arrived at work, everything looked normal. The sculpture, the paintings, the furniture, all back to their original forms. But I knew better now. Je confrontais bien. Something is wrong with this gallery, I said, my voice shaking. Things are changing. I've seen it. I've documented it. She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed. "Chloe, you're not the first." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place, it's not like other galleries. The art doesn't just exist. It evolves." "Evolves?" I repeated, my voice trembling. She nodded. "It's always been this way. Most people don't notice, or they convince themselves it's their imagination. But some, like you," she trailed off, her gaze distant. "Let's just say the ones who see it don't stay long. Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded. Her eyes darkened, because once you've noticed it, it notices you back. Before I could respond, the hum started again. This time it wasn't faint. It roared through the gallery, shaking the walls, the lights flickering violently. Jen's face twisted in fear. "They're here," she whispered. The shadows spilled across the walls like liquid, stretching and bending, and I realized too late that there was nowhere to run. Now, I'm part of the gallery. I don't know how long I've been here. The art changes around me, pieces appearing and disappearing, but I remain. People walk past, admiring the exhibit, their faces blurred and distant. I want to scream, but I can't. All I can do is wait for someone else to notice. Let's start a new story. At the edge of town. My neighbors are quiet, the kind of people who keep to themselves, so the knock was unusual. It was soft, hesitant, almost polite, but the hour, just past midnight, made it anything but. I froze, sitting on my couch with the TV remote still in my hand. I stared at the door, heart pounding. "Who is it?" I called out, forcing my voice to sound steadier than I felt. No answer, just silence. For a long moment, I debated opening it. I even crept closer to peer through the peephole, but when I did, there was no one there. My hallway stretched out into emptiness, the dim bulb flickering at the far end. I shivered, telling myself it was probably a prank. Kids, maybe, or someone drunk, knocking on the wrong door. But I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I found something odd. On my doorstep, placed perfectly in the center, was a single black feather. It was large and glossy, almost unnaturally pristine. I picked it up hesitantly, turning it over in my hands. It didn't seem like something a bird would just drop. Not there, not like that. But I shook it off, tossed it in the trash, and went about my day. That evening, as I was coming back from work, I noticed a man standing on the sidewalk near my house. He wasn't moving, just standing there, hands in his coat pockets, his face angled slightly toward my place. I slowed down as I approached, the uneasy feeling from the night before creeping back into my chest. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice firm. He didn't respond right away. Then he smiled, a faint, thin curve of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Nice evening," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Yeah," I said, unsure what else to say. "You live around here?" "No," he replied simply. He didn't elaborate, didn't move, didn't look away. I hurried inside and locked the door, peeking through the window to see if he was still there. He was standing motionless on the sidewalk, staring at my house. I thought about calling the police, but what could I even say? A man standing on a public sidewalk wasn't a crime. By the time I checked again, he was gone. That night, I couldn't relax. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made my skin crawl. I double-checked the locks and left the TV on for noise. It was just past 2 a.m. when I heard it again. The knock. This time it was louder, more deliberate. I didn't move. I sat frozen on the couch, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached. When I finally summoned the courage to check the peephole, my stomach dropped. The man from the sidewalk was standing there, his face inches from the door, staring directly into the peephole, as if he knew I was on the other side. My blood turned to ice. "Go away," I managed to choke out, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. He just stood there, breathing slowly, deeply, as if he had all the time in the world. Then, without a word, he stepped back and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. The police didn't take it seriously when I called. No threats, no break-ins. They told me it was probably someone passing through, maybe even a misunderstanding. But I knew it wasn't. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. The next day, I noticed more feathers. They weren't on my doorstep this time, but scattered across the front yard, forming a loose trail that led right to my window. I didn't know what to do. Moving wasn't an option. I didn't have the money for that, but staying felt like waiting for something awful to happen. A week passed with no sign of the man. I started to convince myself that maybe it was over, that he'd moved on. Then one night I woke up to a sound inside the house. It wasn't loud, just a faint creak, but it was enough to jolt me upright in bed. My heart was racing as I strained to hear, every nerve in my body on high alert. There it was again, a soft, deliberate shuffle like someone trying to move quietly. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator that someone was inside my house. They told me to stay on the line, to hide if I could, but my entire body felt frozen. I clutched the phone to my ear as the sounds grew louder, closer. The police arrived in minutes, but by then, the house was silent again. They found no signs of forced entry, no one hiding inside, nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. But when they left, I noticed something on my bed, a single black feather. I didn't sleep for days after that. I started keeping a knife under my pillow, barricading the doors with furniture. But no matter what I did, the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I stepped outside, I felt his eyes on me, even when I couldn't see him. The final time I saw him was 3 nights ago. I was sitting on my couch, exhausted but too afraid to sleep, when a shadow passed by my window. I froze, staring at the curtains, waiting for him to knock. But he didn't. Instead, something slid through the mail slot. A piece of paper, folded neatly in half. My hands trembled as I opened it. The note was written in small, meticulous handwriting. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Just let me in. I don't know what he wants or why he chose me. But I know one thing for certain. This isn't over. He's still out there, waiting, watching, and I'm not sure how much longer I can hold him off." Let's start a new story. I was driving through the desert when it started. The trip was supposed to be a quick detour, a shortcut through the Nevada backroads to save an hour. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the horizon smeared with the last remnants of twilight, and my car's headlights barely seemed to dent the vast, inky blackness ahead. The GPS on my phone had long since lost its signal, and I was relying on gut instinct and the occasional faded road sign to guide me. The desert at night is an alien place, more a void than a landscape. There's no sound but the hum of your engine, no movement except the shifting of shadows in your peripherals. Every now and then, a scraggly bush or a hunk of rock would loom up in the headlights, then vanish just as quickly into the dark. It was hypnotic, lulling me into a strange, quiet sense of unease. The road stretched on endlessly, a thin ribbon cutting through nothingness. That's when I saw it. A single light far ahead, faint but unmistakable, hovering low near the ground. Relief washed over me. A gas station, maybe? A diner? I hadn't seen another soul in nearly an hour, and the thought of a warm cup of coffee and human company was enough to make my chest loosen. But as I got closer, the light didn't get brighter. It stayed the same weak, flickering glow, like a candle fighting against a strong wind. I squinted, leaning forward in my seat. It wasn't coming from a building or even a street lamp. It was just there, floating a few feet above the cracked asphalt. I slowed the car, creeping closer, until the light resolved into something stranger, a lantern. An old-fashioned, oil-burning lantern, the kind you'd expect to see in the hands of a 19th century coal miner. It swayed gently in the air, as if held by invisible fingers. There was no pole or string suspending it, no person nearby. Just the lantern, burning steadily in defiance of logic. Every part of me screamed to keep driving, to speed past it and not look back. But I stopped. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe, or that stupid, instinctive human need to explain the unexplainable. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I rolled the window down, letting the cold desert air pour into the car. "Hello." My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the vast emptiness around me. The lantern didn't move, didn't flicker. It hung there, utterly still, casting its faint circle of golden light on the cracked pavement below. I leaned out of the window, trying to see if anyone or anything was nearby. That's when I noticed the footprints. There was a single set of them, bare and human, leading directly up to the lantern. They were deep, as though pressed into the earth with deliberate force, but they ended abruptly in the middle of the road. No sign of someone walking away. No tire tracks or animal prints. Just those solitary, haunting steps leading to nowhere. A sudden chill prickled my skin, and I yanked my head back into the car, rolling up the window with trembling fingers. The engine was still running, the radio crackling faintly with static, but the comforting hum of the car felt distant. I couldn't take my eyes off the lantern. Then it moved. Not much, just a slight sway, as if caught by a non-existent breeze. But it was enough to send my heart hammering. My hands fumbled with the gear shift, throwing the car into drive. I hit the gas hard, tires squealing as I sped past the lantern. In the rear-view mirror, I watched it grow smaller and smaller, a lonely flame shrinking into the darkness. That's when I saw the figure. It was standing on the side of the road, just at the edge of my taillights. A tall, thin silhouette, perfectly still, its head tilted slightly to the side, as if watching me. I couldn't make out any details, no face, no features, just the shape of a person carved out of shadow. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the car's engine roaring as the speedometer climbed. My eyes flicked between the road ahead and the mirror, desperate to see if the figure was still there. But the farther I drove, the darker it became. No lights, no signs, no landmarks. Just mile after mile of empty road. The unease settled into something heavier, colder. I felt like I wasn't alone anymore, like something had hitched a ride. The static on the radio grew louder, crackling and popping in irregular bursts. I reached out to turn it off, but as my fingers brushed the dial, the sound shifted. It wasn't static anymore. It was a voice. "You shouldn't have stopped." My hand jerked back like I'd been burned. The voice was faint, distorted, but undeniably there. A woman's voice, low and calm, as though she were sitting in the passenger seat, speaking directly into my ear. "You shouldn't have stopped," it repeated, clearer this time. I slammed the radio off, my breathing ragged. The road stretched on endlessly, the car's headlights cutting futilely through the dark. The world outside felt too big, too empty, as if I'd driven straight out of reality and into somewhere else entirely. That's when the headlights flickered. For a heartbeat, they cut out completely, plunging me into total darkness. The car kept moving, tires humming against the pavement, but I couldn't see a thing. Then the lights came back on, and I wasn't alone. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, directly in my path. I screamed, yanking the wheel hard to the left. The car swerved violently, tires skidding on loose gravel before slamming to a halt. My chest heaved as I gripped the wheel, every nerve in my body screaming to move. But I couldn't, because the figure was standing just outside my window now. It didn't knock. It didn't lean down to peer inside. It just stood there, inches away, its head tilted at that same unnatural angle. Even through the glass, I could feel its presence, radiating cold and silence. The lantern appeared in its hand. I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I got the car moving again, speeding blindly through the desert until I reached the nearest town at dawn. I stumbled into a diner, shaking, barely coherent, and told the waitress everything. She listened quietly, her face unreadable, then asked one question. "Did it follow you?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone, I'll see a faint light in the distance. And I'll feel the road stretch longer than it should, the shadows deepen, and the static on the radio begin to crackle. I don't stop anymore. Let's start a new story. Grandmother passed. The place just sat there, collecting dust and memories, like a mausoleum for our family's quieter moments. It was tucked at the end of a forgotten road, surrounded by wild woods that seemed determined to swallow it whole. The kind of house you could feel before you saw, with creaking floors and shadows that lingered too long. I only came back because of the will. "You need to go through her things," my mother had said. "She wanted you to have something." I didn't argue. There was no point. But now, standing in the overgrown driveway with the key in my hand, I hesitated. The air felt too heavy, too still, like the house had been holding its breath, waiting for me to return. The front door groaned in protest as I pushed it open. Inside, the smell of lavender and mothballs hit me, a familiar cocktail of my grandmother's presence. Everything was just as I remembered. The worn floral couch, the antique clock ticking faintly in the corner, and the strange sense that time didn't quite move here. I started upstairs, the key biting into my palm. My grandmother's room was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. I nudged it open, and there it was, the old wooden chest, sitting at the foot of her bed like a sentinel. It didn't look remarkable, just a faded trunk with brass hinges, but I felt an odd reluctance as I crouched in front of it. The key slid into the lock easily, and with a soft click, the lid lifted. Inside was a collection of seemingly random objects: a stack of yellowed letters, a bundle of dried flowers, a small hand mirror, and a photograph in a tarnished silver frame. I picked up the photo first. It showed my grandmother as a young woman, standing in front of the very house I was in. She was smiling, but there was something off about the image. The sky behind her was too pale, the trees too blurred, as if the world hadn't quite settled into focus. Beneath the photograph was a folded piece of paper. I opened it carefully, and my stomach dropped as I read the words written in my grandmother's delicate cursive. "Don't trust the second door." I glanced around the room, my pulse quickening. What second door? The closet? The hallway? The words swam in my mind, heavy with implication. Shaking it off, I packed the contents of the chest into a bag. Maybe she was referring to something figurative, some metaphorical advice for life. I didn't stay to puzzle it out. The house already felt too strange, too alive, and the air seemed to press against me, urging me to leave. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, something stopped me. A door I didn't remember stood halfway down the hall, nestled between the kitchen and the living room. It was plain, painted the same soft cream as the walls, but there was no mistaking it. It hadn't been there before. I stared at it, heart thundering. "Don't trust the second door," the note had said. But how could a door just appear? I turned away, willing myself to ignore it, but the faintest noise stopped me in my tracks, a rhythmic, almost musical tapping from the other side. "Hello!" My voice sounded small in the empty house. The tapping stopped. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that even as my hand reached for the knob. But the curiosity was unbearable, a gravitational pull I couldn't resist. The door swung open silently, revealing a staircase spiraling downward. The space beyond was dimly lit by a soft, golden glow, though I couldn't see its source. The air that wafted up was warm and faintly metallic, carrying a sound I could only describe as breathing. I should have left right then. I should have slammed the door and run. But something about the light, or the sound, or the way the stairs seemed to beckon, compelled me forward. I stepped through. The staircase felt endless. With each turn, the walls around me changed. At first, they were plain plaster, but soon they morphed into polished wood, then rough stone, then something smooth and black that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. My footsteps echoed strangely, as though the sound was bouncing back at me from an impossible distance. Finally, the stairs ended. I stepped into a room so vast that the ceiling and walls disappeared in a shadow. The golden glow was stronger here, emanating from a series of strange, floating orbs that pulsed gently, like hearts. Beneath them stood rows of cabinets, each identical to the chest in my grandmother's room. And then I saw her. She was sitting at a small wooden table in the center of the room, her back to me. Her silver hair was tied neatly in the braid she always wore, and her hands rested on the table, folded as if in prayer. "Grandma?" My voice broke the silence like a stone shattering glass. She turned slowly, her movements deliberate. Her face was the same, every wrinkle and freckle exactly as I remembered. But her eyes, they were wrong. Too wide, too dark, and when she smiled, it was a fraction too slow, as though the muscles in her face didn't quite know how to work. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice layered with echoes that didn't match her lips. "But since you're here," she gestured to the table. "See?" I didn't move. My legs felt frozen, rooted to the ground. "This isn't real," I stammered. "You're not real." Her head tilted, a puppet-like motion that sent a shiver down my spine. "No," she agreed. "But neither are you." Before I could react, the room shifted. The floor rippled like water, and the cabinets vanished, replaced by endless rows of doors. Each one was slightly ajar, spilling faint whispers into the air. I turned back to my grandmother, but she was gone. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony that threatened to drown me. I stumbled backward, searching for the staircase, for anything familiar, but the room offered no escape. Only the doors remained. One of them opened wider, and from its depths, I saw something step forward. Not a person, not an animal, but something that moved like both. Its limbs were too long, its face a shifting blur, and as it approached, I realized the whispers weren't coming from the room. They were coming from it. The last thing I heard before I blacked out was my own voice, echoing back at me from the creature's formless mouth. Don't trust the second door. When I woke up, I was back in the living room, sprawled on the floor. The second door was gone, the house quiet. But I wasn't alone. The chest from my grandmother's room now sat in the middle of the floor, its lid slightly open. Inside, there was only one item, a photograph of me, standing in front of the house, smiling. But the background was wrong. The sky was too pale, the trees blurred, and in the window behind me, someone or something was watching. Let's start a new story. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was in the cereal aisle of the grocery store. A small, unremarkable detail. A box of Raisin Bran on the wrong shelf, nestled between Honey Nut Cheerios and Cinnamon Toast Crunch. I wasn't even planning to buy cereal, but something about it felt off. When I glanced at it again, it was gone. Not someone must have moved it gone. The entire box had disappeared, as if I'd imagined it. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space on the shelf. A kid bumped into my cart, snapping me out of my daze, and I hurried along, chalking it up to nothing. But that night, I couldn't shake it. That box, that moment. It lingered in my mind, unreasonably persistent, like the outline of a picture burned into your vision after staring at it too long. 2 days later, something else happened. I was walking home from work, taking my usual shortcut through the park. The sun was low, the light soft and golden, making the grass and trees glow. I passed a man sitting on a bench, wearing a faded baseball cap. He was reading a newspaper, one leg crossed over the other. Nothing unusual, except when I glanced back over my shoulder, there he was again, on a completely different bench farther down the path in the exact same pose. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped, staring. He didn't look up, didn't seem to notice me, but the newspaper in his hands had shifted. The headline was the same, but the page was different. I walked faster, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe he'd moved quickly while I wasn't paying attention. Maybe there were two men who just happened to look identical. But in my gut, I knew something wasn't right. The glitches grew louder after that. I'd leave my keys on the counter and find them later in the fridge. My cat, who never left my bedroom during the day, began appearing in rooms I'd sworn I'd closed off. Music from my playlist would skip to songs I didn't recognize, and when I checked my phone, there was no record of them. Once, I woke up to find my furniture rearranged. Not dramatically, just subtle shifts. My armchair was a foot closer to the window. My bookshelf had 2 new books on it, titles I'd never seen before, The Echoes of Elsewhere and Field Guide to Anomalies. Both were written by an author named N.T. Elric. I flipped through them, and every page was blank. It wasn't until a week later that I saw my double. It was early evening, and I was taking out the trash. The sun was setting, washing everything in a deep orange glow. As I reached the curb, I saw someone walking up the street, a figure wearing a hoodie, their hands stuffed into the pockets. The closer they got, the more uneasy I felt. Their posture, their gait, it was too familiar. When they passed under a streetlight, I froze. It was me, not someone who looked like me. It was me. Same hoodie, same jeans, same face. But they didn't even glance at me as they passed. They just kept walking, their head down, moving with a calm confidence that made my skin crawl. I turned to follow, calling out, "Hey!" But as soon as the word left my mouth, they turned a corner and disappeared. When I reached the corner seconds later, the street was empty. I barely slept that night. From then on, the double started appearing more frequently. Always in the periphery of my vision, on the opposite platform at the subway, a shadowy figure in the park, walking past my apartment building as I stood by the window. Each time, they lingered just long enough for me to recognize them before vanishing. One night, I decided to confront them. I left my apartment and walked aimlessly through the city, hoping to draw them out. The streets felt strange, unfamiliar, even though I'd lived here for years. Buildings were taller than they should have been, their windows dark and hollow. Street signs pointed to intersections that didn't exist. I finally saw them standing under a flickering street lamp, their back turned to me. My heart pounded as I approached, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Who are you?" I demanded. They didn't move. I took another step closer. "Why do you look like me?" Still nothing. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched their shoulder. The moment I did, the world around me fractured. The street lamp exploded into shards of light. The buildings dissolved into swirling mist, and the figure turned to face me. It wasn't my face anymore. Their features were shifting, morphing like a reflection in rippling water. Eyes, nose, mouth, all sliding into configurations that shouldn't have been possible. When they finally spoke, their voice came from everywhere at once, deep and resonant. "You're not supposed to be here." "What does that mean?" I stammered, backing away. They tilted their head, their face settling briefly into an eerie mimicry of mine. "You're not supposed to notice." "Notice what?" The world around us continued to disintegrate, the mist swirling faster, pulling at my clothes, my hair. "This," they said, gesturing vaguely to the chaos. "The bleed. The overlap. It's getting worse." "Why?" I shouted over the growing roar. "What's happening to me?" They stepped closer, their shifting face now a blur. "It's not just you. It's everything. This reality, it's unraveling." Before I could ask more, they reached out and pressed their hand to my chest. The contact sent a jolt through my body, and the next thing I knew, I was back in my apartment, gasping for air. The clock read 6:31 a.m. My microwave, of course. But now, every clock in the apartment said the same thing. 6:31. My phone wouldn't turn on, and when I looked out the window, the city was frozen. Cars were paused mid-intersection. A bird hung motionless in the sky, and the world was bathed in an unnatural, pale light. And then I saw them again, standing across the street, staring up at my window. It wasn't just one of them now. It was 3, 4. A crowd of shifting figures, all wearing my face, all watching, waiting. I don't know what they want. I don't know if they're me, or if I'm them, or if this is all some unraveling thread of a reality I no longer belong to. But I'm afraid to leave, and I'm afraid to stay, because I'm starting to notice things I shouldn't. And the more I notice, the worse it gets. Let's start a new story. Up in a building that smelled vaguely of burnt toast and mothballs. The kind of place you settle for when your budget is stretched and your standards are, let's say, flexible. I wasn't expecting much from the neighborhood. Quiet streets, older folks walking their dogs, nothing to write home about. But the package was strange from the start. It was sitting on the floor in front of my door one morning, a brown box wrapped with twine instead of tape. No shipping label, no return address. Just my name, Eleanor Baird, written in ink that had bled slightly, as if the writer had pressed too hard or the pen had been wet. I didn't think much of it at first. People get the wrong packages all the time, right? I'd been ordering furniture and household essentials since I moved in, and I assumed it was just an unmarked delivery. So I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. It was a picture of my apartment door. I stared at it for a long moment, the little square of glossy paper sitting heavily in my hands. The details in the photo were unmistakable. The brass numbers, the faint scratch on the paint from when I tried to jam the lock open on my first day. The picture had been taken recently, at night, judging by the faint glow of the hallway light. A chill ran down my spine. I checked the hallway, but it was empty. The building was quiet, as always. My neighbors, a retired couple who played soft jazz on their record player most evenings, wouldn't have done something like this. They barely remembered my name. I told myself it was a prank, some kid messing around, maybe a bored delivery driver with a weird sense of humor. But I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me like cobwebs. The next morning, there was another package. This one was smaller, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with the same twine. My name was written on it again, the ink smudged slightly as if the writer had been in a hurry. Inside was another photograph. This one was of my living room window. From the outside, I froze. The window in the photo was unmistakable, cracked slightly open, the pale curtains fluttering in the breeze. It had been like that the night before. Whoever took the picture had been standing in the alley behind the building. I locked the window immediately, my hands trembling as I slid the latch into place. Then I called the building manager. "Are there cameras in the hallways?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Nah, this is an old building," he replied, his tone unconcerned. "But I can change the locks if you're worried." I wasn't sure if a new lock would fix anything, but I agreed. For the next week, there were no packages, no photos, no strange markings or scratches on my door. I started to relax, convincing myself that it had been a random prank, maybe someone who'd moved on to another target. But then I found the third package. It was waiting for me on the kitchen counter when I came home from work. My stomach dropped. I knew I hadn't left it there. This one wasn't wrapped. It was just a plain cardboard box with the lid folded shut. I opened it slowly, dread pooling in my chest. Inside was another photograph. This one was of me. I was sitting on the couch, wearing the sweatshirt I'd worn 3 nights ago. My face was turned toward the television, eyes half lidded with boredom. The angle of the shot was strange, like it had been taken from above, as though someone had been standing over me. I staggered back, my breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. Someone had been in my apartment. The police didn't take it seriously. "We don't have much to go on," the officer said as he scribbled in his notebook. "Could be someone you know playing a joke. Could be an ex. You sure you haven't given anyone a key?" "No," I said firmly. He promised to send a patrol car by the building occasionally, but it was clear he didn't think this was worth his time. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building, every rustle of wind outside my window felt like a warning. I kept the lights on and stayed awake until dawn. The fourth package arrived 3 days later. This one was different, heavier, larger. I didn't want to open it, but I had to know. Inside was a clock, one of those old-fashioned ones with brass hands and Roman numerals. It wasn't running, the hands frozen at 3:17. There was a sticky note on the face of the clock, written in the same uneven handwriting as the other packages. "Time's almost up." I threw the box across the room, the sound of the clock hitting the wall echoing in the silence. I didn't know what else to do, so I packed a bag and left. I drove for hours, no destination in mind, just the overwhelming need to put distance between me and that apartment. I checked into a motel off the highway, a place with peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of mildew. It wasn't safe, not really, but it was somewhere else. That night, as I sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the muted television, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was simple: "Running won't help." I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. When I looked back at the screen, there was a second message. "Check the window." I turned slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing on the other side of the glass. And the smell of twine filled the room. "Let's start a new story," told me, but did. I was halfway through unpacking my new apartment. Boxes everywhere, the walls still bare, when the old landline I hadn't even set up yet buzzed loudly from the kitchen. I froze. The phone wasn't even mine. It had come with the place. A chunky rotary relic bolted to the wall like a stubborn leftover from another era. I hadn't thought to test it, assuming it was dead or disconnected. Yet here it was, ringing insistently in a too-sharp burst that echoed against the empty walls. I hesitated, then picked up the receiver. "Hello?" The line crackled faintly. "You're home," said a voice, calm and confident, as if we were old friends. "Who is this?" I asked, my grip tightening on the receiver. The voice didn't answer. Instead, after a beat of silence, it added, "You should check the storage room. Left-hand corner." Then it hung up. I stood there for a long moment, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the static hum of the deadline. The sound seemed to seep into my head, making my thoughts heavy and slow. Who calls a landline in 2024? I told myself it was probably a prank, someone targeting the new tenant. But how would they know I just moved in? I set the phone back in its cradle and tried to shrug it off. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the storage room. The storage room wasn't technically mine. It was a shared space in the basement, full of old lockers and forgotten junk left behind by former tenants. When I first toured the apartment, the landlord had breezed past it, saying, "You can store some things down here if you want, but honestly, most people don't bother." I told myself I wouldn't bother either, but now, curiosity was gnawing at me. I went downstairs with my phone's flashlight. The basement smelled damp and faintly metallic, like old pipes and rusting metal. The storage room was at the far end, its door slightly ajar. I nudged it open with my foot, and the hinges creaked in protest. Inside, it was darker than I expected. Rows of lockers lined the walls, their paint peeling in flakes. A few wooden crates sat stacked in one corner, and there was an old chest shoved against the far wall. Nothing seemed unusual, but then I saw it, the left-hand corner. There was a wooden pallet leaning upright against the wall, as though it had been placed there to hide something. My stomach tightened, and I tried to laugh at myself. This is how horror movies start, I thought. But the phone call had wormed its way into my brain, and I couldn't leave without knowing. I moved the pallet. Behind it was a small door, low to the ground, its surface warped and grimy. It wasn't a proper door, more like an access panel, the kind you'd expect to find leading to plumbing or wiring. But this door had something strange etched into it. Symbols. They were crude, scratched into the wood with what looked like the tip of a knife. Circles overlapping circles, jagged spirals, lines crisscrossing in jagged angles. I stared at them, feeling a faint pull, as if the symbols themselves were vibrating slightly under my gaze. The rational part of me said to leave it alone, but another part, the part drawn forward by sheer irrational compulsion, won out. I twisted the small, rusted latch and pulled the door open. Inside was a space no larger than a crawl space, and it was almost empty. Almost. Sitting in the middle was a small porcelain doll. Its white face stared up at me with lifeless black eyes, and its painted lips were frozen in a faint smirk. The doll was dressed in faded lace, its fabric yellowed with age. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My flashlight wavered in my hand, and the beam of light flickered over the doll's features. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, as if the basement itself were holding its breath. Then, without thinking, I reached for the doll. As soon as my fingers brushed its surface, the phone upstairs started ringing. I jerked back, dropping the flashlight. It hit the floor, spinning wildly, the light throwing erratic shapes across the walls. The phone's shrill, insistent ringing echoed through the building, louder than it should have been, louder than seemed possible. I grabbed the flashlight and bolted upstairs, my pulse thundering in my ears. The phone kept ringing as I burst into the kitchen. I hesitated only a moment before snatching it off the hook. "Hello," I gasped. "Put it back." The voice was different this time, lower, raspier, like it was being spoken through clenched teeth. "Who is this? What's going on?" "Put it back." The line went dead. My hand was shaking as I set the receiver down. I stood there, staring at the phone, half expecting it to ring again. But the silence was worse. The whole apartment felt wrong now, like the walls were leaning and slightly pressing against me. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But instead, I went back to the basement. The storage room was just as I'd left it, but the pallet was back in place, leaning against the wall, as though I'd never moved it. My stomach churned as I approached it, and I hesitated before reaching out. When I pulled the pallet away, the small door was closed again, the crude symbols glaring up at me in the flashlight's glow. I reached for the latch. The door opened easily, and my breath caught in my throat. The doll was gone. I stared into the empty space, my thoughts racing, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I slammed the little door shut and shoved the pallet back into place, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. I haven't gone back to the basement since. That night, I moved my mattress into the living room and slept with every light in the apartment on. The phone hasn't rung again, but sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear the faint echo of it, a sound that isn't really there. And sometimes, when I walk past the kitchen, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of white like porcelain disappearing around the corner. Let's start a new story. I'd packed the night before, filled my water bottles, and even tossed a few granola bars into my bag. The sun was barely up when I started my car, the air cool and sharp with autumn's bite. I drove down Main Street, turned left at the gas station, and took the old country road that cut through the woods, the fastest route out of town. 15 minutes in, the road curved, as it always had, around a bend lined with tall, skeletal pines. But when I rounded the curve, I found myself back on Main Street. At first, I thought I'd made a mistake. Maybe I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere, though I'd driven that road 100 times before. So I tried again. This time, I kept my eyes glued to the GPS. The little blue dot on the screen tracked my progress, winding its way along the road until it didn't. One moment, I was halfway to the highway. The next, the blue dot blinked, and I was back at the gas station. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the GPS, watching as it recalculated, and trying not to think about the tightening knot in my chest. By the third attempt, I was starting to sweat. I drove slower this time, checking every sign, every tree, every inch of the road for something I'd missed. But no matter what I did, no matter how careful I was, the curve always brought me back to Main Street. Always. I parked in front of the diner, my hands shaking on the wheel. Inside, the morning crowd buzzed with the usual hum of conversation. Farmers in flannel shirts, a pair of teenagers glued to their phones, a waitress pouring coffee. Everything looked normal, too normal. I tried asking the waitress if there was construction on the old country road, or if maybe the highway was closed. She gave me a puzzled look, like she didn't understand the question. "The highway's fine," she said, her voice cheerful but distant. "But I can't seem to get out of town," I said, laughing nervously, hoping she'd laugh back, that she'd tell me I was being ridiculous. Her smile froze. For a moment, just a moment, her eyes flickered with something like recognition or fear. Then it was gone, replaced by the same vacant cheer. "Maybe you just need more coffee," she said. When I got back in my car, the engine struggled to start. The radio crackled, spitting static that almost sounded like a voice. I didn't go home. I drove instead, taking every road I could think of, north, south, east, west, trying every possible route out of town. But no matter where I went, no matter which direction I took, I always ended up back at Main Street. By the time the sun set, I was exhausted. That night, I started noticing the people. It wasn't anything obvious at first. The couple next door still sat on their porch, sipping wine like they did every evening. The kids on Maple Street still played basketball under the flickering streetlight. But when I waved to Mrs. Lowry, the elderly woman who lived across the street, she didn't wave back. She always waved back. She just stood there on her porch, staring at me, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. I stepped outside to ask if she was okay. But the moment I crossed the threshold, she turned and walked back into her house, shutting the door firmly behind her. When I looked around, I realized the other neighbors had gone inside too. All at once, the street was empty, the basketball abandoned, the porch lights clicking off one by one. I went back inside and locked every door. Over the next few days, the changes became impossible to ignore. The mail stopped coming. The streetlights stayed on during the day, but flickered out at night. The air smelled strange, metallic, almost like rust. And the people, they were still there, still walking their dogs and mowing their lawns, still sitting at the diner or jogging down the sidewalk. But their movements were stiff, mechanical, as though they were going through the motions of being human. One afternoon, I saw Mr. Carter, the friendly man who owned the hardware store, standing in the middle of the crosswalk. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his head tilted slightly to one side. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. When I got closer, I realized his eyes weren't blinking. They weren't even wet. I backed away slowly, my breath catching in my throat. That night, I heard the footsteps. They started around midnight, heavy and deliberate, moving up and down the street. I peeked through the curtains, expecting to see someone out for a late-night walk. But there was no one there, just the sound pacing back and forth like it was waiting for something. When the footsteps stopped, I thought it was over. Then came a knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft, almost polite tap on the front door. I didn't answer. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I crept to the door, my heart pounding, and peered through the peephole. The street was empty. The knock came a third time, harder now, rattling the door in its frame. I stepped back, clutching the baseball bat I kept in the closet, and whispered, "Who's there?" The knock stopped. The doorknob began to turn. I don't know how long I can stay here. The food in my fridge is running out, and the tap water tastes like copper. The humming is louder now, vibrating through the walls, the floors, my bones. And the people, they've stopped pretending. This morning, I saw Mrs. Lowry standing in her window, staring at me with that same wide, unblinking gaze. When I turned away, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. She wasn't alone. There were others with her, their faces pressed against the glass. Watching, waiting. I don't know what they want or why they haven't come inside yet. Maybe they're toying with me. Maybe they're waiting for the right moment. All I know is this. When the humming stops, so will I. Let's start a new story. Not the timestamp, not the 1 second duration, not even the weird static that buzzed faintly through my phone when I played it. Just the fact that it came from me. It wasn't a big deal at first. I assumed it was a glitch, some pocket dial, or an accidental call to my voicemail. Technology isn't perfect. I didn't even think about it again until the second voicemail showed up 3 days later. Same number, same duration, same static. This time, though, the static wasn't random. I had to replay it 4 or 5 times, cranking up the volume and holding the phone to my ear, but underneath the buzzing, there was a sound, a faint, distorted voice, its cadence uneven, like it had been slowed down and warped. I couldn't make out the words, but it made my skin crawl. I deleted it and told myself it wasn't worth worrying about. But the voicemails kept coming. They came at odd hours, 3:12 a.m., 2:47 p.m., once during a meeting at work where my boss shot me a look that could peel paint off walls. Always the same number. Always the same 1 second clip of static and something hiding inside it. By the 5th voicemail, I was obsessed. I downloaded it to my computer and ran it through free audio software I'd found online. The voice was clearer now, though still warped, like someone trying to speak underwater. This time, I understood it. "Can you hear me?" My chest tightened. I stared at the waveform on my screen, my brain scrambling for answers. It had to be a prank. Someone with a voice changer, spoofing my number. It had to be. I deleted the file and closed the laptop, but the words stuck with me. That night, I dreamed of a phone ringing in the dark. It rang once, then twice, then stopped. I woke up drenched in sweat, my phone vibrating on the nightstand. The screen lit up with an incoming call. My name, my number. The sound was deafening. Not a regular ringtone. This was louder, harsher, a mechanical screech that made my teeth ache. My hands shook as I picked up the phone and pressed decline. The moment the screen went dark, it lit up again. Another call. Same number. This time, I answered. The line was silent. "Who is this?" I whispered. No response. Just faint breathing, low and wet like someone struggling to inhale. I was about to hang up when the voice spoke. "It's you." The call ended. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I threw the phone in a drawer and left the house early, determined to distract myself. Work helped, but the itch at the back of my mind never went away. By the time I got home, I convinced myself it was all a coincidence, some elaborate scam. That's when I found the note. It was waiting on my kitchen counter, a single sheet of lined paper covered in jagged handwriting. Answer. The letters looked like they'd been carved into the page. Deep, angry grooves tore through the paper, leaving tiny flecks of wood from the pencil embedded in the indentations. I didn't write it. I didn't even own a pencil. I checked every lock, every window. I left the TV on for background noise, but the hum of the static on the channel I picked sounded too much like the voicemails. That night, I left the phone in the drawer and unplugged it from the charger. It didn't matter. At 3:12 a.m., the screen turned on by itself. The light seeped through the drawer, spilling across the room like an open wound. I wanted to ignore it, but the vibration began, a faint hum at first, then louder, shaking the wood. The drawer burst open, and the phone slid out, landing face down on the floor. It rang. My name. My number. I didn't want to answer. I didn't even want to look at it. But my hand moved on its own, fingers closing around the device, raising it to my ear. This time, the voice was clearer. You shouldn't have ignored me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. Do you remember? The voice sounded like mine, but distorted, layered with something deeper, darker. Remember what? I managed to choke out. The line hissed with static. Then the words came slowly, like a knife dragging against skin. What you did? The line went dead. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, that it was a nightmare I hadn't fully woken up from. But when I looked around, something in the room had shifted. The furniture was in the same places, the lights still on, but the air felt heavier. The shadows in the corners stretched farther than they should have, pooling around me like ink. On the floor, where the phone had landed, was a fresh piece of paper. Answer. This time, there was more. Beneath the word was an address. It wasn't far. I don't know why I went. Curiosity? Fear? Guilt? The address led me to an abandoned house on the edge of town. Its windows boarded up and its front door hanging open like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. Inside, the air was thick with rot, the floorboards creaking underfoot as I moved through the rooms. I didn't know what I was looking for until I found it. A mirror, cracked and dirty, leaning against the far wall of what might have once been a living room. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't mine. Its face was pale, gaunt, its eyes sunken and rimmed with black. And it was smiling. The phone in my hand buzzed, the vibration sharp enough to sting my palm. The screen lit up one last time. My name, my number. The reflection mouthed the words as they appeared on the screen. It's your turn. Let's start a new story. It was the note on my nightstand that started everything. Don't forget to lock the door. The handwriting wasn't mine. I live alone, so there was no one else who could have written it. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, but the back was blank. Just a single sentence, written in black ink, in an unfamiliar but oddly neat script. The door was locked. It always was. I'm meticulous about it. Growing up in a bad neighborhood leaves that habit burned into you. I checked the lock again anyway, just to be sure. Twisting it felt satisfying, grounding, safe. By the time I returned to my room, the note was gone. I froze, scanning the nightstand. It wasn't there. I checked under the bed, the covers, the floor. Nothing. For the rest of the night, I barely slept. The next morning, I told myself it had to be some kind of prank. Maybe I'd been sleepwalking, or maybe one of my friends had snuck in as a joke. The thought didn't sit well, but it was better than the alternative. That evening, I double-checked every window and door before going to bed. My apartment was secure, locked up tight. No sign of forced entry. When I woke up, there was another note. It's watching you. I stared at the note for what felt like an eternity. My hands shook as I reached for it. The handwriting was the same, precise, almost delicate. I didn't leave my apartment that day. I sat by the door, clutching the note, waiting for anyone, to explain what the hell was going on. Hours passed. No one came. When night fell, I turned on every light in the apartment and stayed awake, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, trying to distract myself. But when my eyelids grew heavy, I gave in, collapsing onto the couch instead of my bed, unwilling to be alone in the dark. I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint, rhythmic, like nails dragging lightly across wood. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I thought I'd dreamed it. Then I heard it again. The sound was coming from the front door. I sat up, heart pounding. My phone was still in my hand, and I fumbled to turn on the flashlight. Slowly, I crept toward the door, each creak of the floorboards setting my teeth on edge. Hello? I called out, my voice shaky. The scratching stopped. For a long moment, I stood there, staring at the door. My hand hovered over the knob, and then I saw it. The shadow beneath the door stretched, shifting unnaturally, like it didn't belong to anything real. It wasn't the shadow of a person. It was too thin, too jagged. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. The shadow didn't move. Then something slid under the door. Another note. I stared at it, frozen, before finally bending down to pick it up. My hands were trembling so badly, I almost tore the paper. Open it. I bolted. I grabbed my car keys and fled. not bothering to turn off the lights or lock the door behind me. I drove aimlessly for hours. The note crumpled in my pocket. The words burned into my brain. When I finally returned home, the apartment felt different. It wasn't anything obvious. The furniture was in the same place, the lights still on. But the air felt heavier, like the room was holding its breath. On the kitchen counter was another note. "Welcome back." I grabbed a knife from the drawer and tore through the apartment, flinging open closets, checking under beds, behind curtains. No one was there. For the next week, the notes kept coming. Sometimes they were warnings. "It's getting closer." Sometimes they were questions. "Why don't you look?" Once it was just a single word. "Run." I stopped sleeping. Every night, I sat in the living room with the lights on, gripping the knife, waiting for something to happen. The scratching at the door became a nightly ritual, always faint, always rhythmic. And then one night it stopped. I thought it was over. I let myself breathe for the first time in days, finally daring to sleep in my bed again. But when I woke up, the world was wrong. It was subtle at first. My alarm clock showed a time that didn't make sense, 3:03 a.m., though the sun was shining through the windows. The photos on my wall were different. The people in them had unfamiliar faces, their smiles frozen and unnatural. The apartment itself felt bigger, like the walls had stretched overnight. The air buzzed faintly, like static from an old TV. On the dining table was another note. "You're almost there." I tried to leave. I grabbed my keys and ran for the door, but when I opened it, there was nothing outside. Not the hallway, not the street, just blackness. It wasn't the kind of darkness you see at night. It was deeper, infinite, as though the world had been erased beyond the boundaries of my apartment. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. That's when I saw the final note. It was lying on the floor, right where the shadow had been. "You're not supposed to be here." The hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls, through my chest, until it felt like my entire body was coming apart. The lights flickered wildly, and the air seemed to ripple, bending and twisting like heat waves. And then the door opened. I don't know how. It was locked, but it swung inward slowly, revealing nothing but the same infinite blackness. And in that blackness, something moved. It was tall and spindly, its limbs too long, its body folding and unfolding as it stepped into the room. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was blank, smooth, and featureless, yet somehow watching. It reached out to me, its hand impossibly long, its fingers tapering to points that didn't quite look solid. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it spoke. Not with words, but with a voice that echoed directly in my mind. "You were warned." The last thing I saw was its hand reaching for my face. When I woke up, I was lying in my bed. Everything looked normal. The notes were gone. The photos were back to their original faces. The world outside the window bright and alive. But every night since, at exactly 3:03 a.m., I wake up to the sound of scratching at the door. I don't think it's finished with me. Let's start a new story. It began with a noise. Not a crash or a bang. Nothing dramatic. Just a faint, repetitive sound that crept into my awareness late one night. Tick, tick, tick. Like a clock, but slower, heavier, almost deliberate. I thought it was coming from the old pipes in my apartment at first. The place was ancient, the kind of building where everything rattled, groaned, or hissed at some point. But as I lay there in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, I realized it wasn't coming from the walls. The sound was closer, just beyond the door to my bedroom. Tick, tick, tick. I got up, heart pounding harder than I wanted to admit. My phone's flashlight was weak, but it was better than nothing. The hallway outside my bedroom was empty. No shadows shifting, no doors ajar. But the sound didn't stop. It seemed to move as I moved, always just out of reach. It wasn't coming from the apartment. It was following me through it. I told myself it was in my head. I went back to bed, turned on a podcast to drown it out, and eventually fell asleep. But the next morning, I found something that made me question everything. There was a groove in the hardwood floor outside my bedroom door. It hadn't been there before, about a foot long, The wood had been worn down in a clean, sharp line, like something had been dragged across it over and over again. I crouched down, running my fingers over the groove. It was smooth, unnervingly so, and seemed almost purposeful. I felt something catch under my fingernail and pulled back to find a faint black residue on my skin. It smelled faintly metallic, like burnt wires. I covered the groove with a rug and tried to forget about it. The next few nights were uneventful. I started to convince myself that I'd imagined the noise, that the groove had always been there, and I just never noticed it. But then things escalated. It was a Wednesday night when I came home from work and found my front door unlocked. That alone was unsettling. I double-checked my locks every morning, but what I found inside was worse. Every light in my apartment was on, every bulb burning at full intensity. It was as if someone had tried to flood the space with light to banish every shadow. The rug over the groove was gone. So was the groove itself. The wood was perfectly smooth, as if it had never been touched. I called the landlord, my voice shaking, but he sounded as confused as I was. "No one's been in there," he said. "We don't have a spare key for your unit." I changed the locks the next day. For a while I thought that was the end of it. The noise didn't return, and I slept easier. Until I noticed the time. It was always wrong. Not by much, just a few seconds, then a minute, then several. But the discrepancy grew every day. My phone, my microwave, my wristwatch, even my wall clock. It didn't matter if I reset them. Within hours, they'd be out of sync again. One night, I tried staying up to see what was happening. I sat on the couch, watching the digital clock on the stove blink 11:57 p.m., then 11:58, then nothing. It didn't turn to 11:59. The seconds disappeared. And then I heard it again. Tick, tick, tick. It wasn't faint this time. It was louder, heavier, as if whatever was making the noise had grown bolder. I stood up, my breath catching in my throat, and scanned the room. The sound seemed to pulse through the air, vibrating in my chest. When I turned, I saw the rug I'd replaced in the hallway was gone again. And beneath it, the groove had returned. Longer now, deeper, almost as if something was cutting through the floor from below. The light in the hallway flickered. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The tick grew louder, morphing into something sharper, like a claw tapping against glass. And then it stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting for it to start again. The silence felt worse than the noise. I finally worked up the nerve to step closer to the groove, to crouch down and look. My hand trembled as I reached out, but before I could touch it, the floor beneath the groove moved. It wasn't much, just a faint twitch, a ripple like fabric stretched too tightly. But it was enough to make me pull my hand back and stumble away. The light flickered again, and for a split second, I swear I saw something beneath the floor. Not under the apartment, but inside the wood itself. Something black and writhing, pressing against the surface like it was trapped and trying to get out. I didn't sleep that night. I left the lights on and sat on the couch, staring at the groove until the sun came up. Over the next week, the groove began appearing in other places. The living room, the kitchen, even the bathroom. It wasn't always in the same shape, but the pattern was unmistakable. Long, clean cuts that seemed to spread, connecting across the apartment like veins. I thought about leaving, about finding a new place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it would follow me. That it wasn't tied to the apartment at all, but to me. Last night, I woke up to the sound of ticking again. It was coming from right outside my bedroom door, loud and deliberate. I didn't move. I didn't want to see what was out there. But the door creaked open anyway, slowly, as if something was pushing it. In the faint light from my bedside lamp, I saw the groove extend across the floor, snaking into the room like a living thing. It stopped at the foot of my bed. Then it rose. The groove peeled upward, the wood splitting and cracking as something black and glistening emerged. It didn't have a shape, not exactly, but its presence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was stare as it loomed over me, its surface shifting like liquid. It didn't have eyes, but I knew it was watching me, studying me. It leaned closer, the ticking sound now a deafening roar, and for a moment, I thought I heard it speak. Not in words, but in a feeling that pressed into my mind. You are the door. When I woke up, it was morning. The groove was gone, the floor smooth and untouched. But the clocks in my apartment are all frozen now, stopped at 3:03 a.m. And the ticking? It's coming from inside my chest. Let's start a new story. Death left it to me, but I never wanted it. Too many memories, too many things. But after weeks of emails from the estate lawyer, I caved. My plan was simple. Sort through her belongings, sell what I could, donate the rest, and put the house on the market. In and out on a weekend, the first thing I noticed when I arrived was how alive it still felt. The scent of her lavender hand cream clung to the air, like she'd just been there. The walls seemed to hum faintly, the creak of the floorboards oddly familiar under my feet. It felt less like stepping into a house, and more like walking into someone's skin. The second thing I noticed was the door. It was in the attic, tucked behind a stack of old boxes. I wouldn't have even seen it if I hadn't tripped over a loose floorboard. The door wasn't there when I was a kid. I was sure of it. It was small, barely reaching my hip, with peeling white paint and a tarnished brass knob. No, just a door, wedged into the far corner where the slope of the roof almost touched the floor. I stood there, staring at it, unease prickling my skin. I could feel the air around it, like a faint draft seeping through. It was colder than the rest of the attic. I told myself it was just an old house quirk, probably a crawl space I'd never noticed before. But when I turned the knob, it wouldn't budge. Not locked, not stuck. It just wouldn't move, like the door itself didn't want to open. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house groaned and shifted around me. Its sounds too deliberate, too purposeful. I lay in my childhood bedroom, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, and tried not to think about the attic. But the door crept into my mind anyway, a persistent itch I couldn't scratch. I finally fell asleep just before dawn, but the dreams were worse. I was back in the attic, standing before the door. It was open this time, black as a starless sky inside. Something was breathing on the other side, deep and rhythmic. Then a hand reached out, pale, with too many fingers, and grabbed my wrist. I woke up gasping, sweat-soaked, the phantom pressure of that grip still burning into my skin. But when I turned on the light, my stomach dropped. My wrist was bruised. 5 distinct marks, too long to be human fingers. By the next day, I was exhausted but determined. I wasn't a superstitious person, and I wasn't going to let a stupid door get the better of me. I climbed back into the attic, dragging a crowbar I'd found in the basement. If the door didn't want to open, I'd force it. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. As I approached, the air around the door seemed thicker, heavier, like walking through water. My chest tightened, and my ears rang. I hesitated, crowbar in hand, as the faint hum I'd heard earlier grew louder. It wasn't a hum, it was a voice, low and garbled, speaking words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my gut. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave the house and never come back. But I didn't. Instead, I gripped the crowbar tighter, wedged it into the crack, and pulled. The door didn't open. It didn't even splinter. But the hum stopped. Silence wrapped around me, thick and suffocating. Then, without warning, the knob turned on its own. The door creaked open just an inch, revealing nothing but darkness. The cold draft became a freezing wind, rushing past me and filling the attic with the smell of damp earth and metal. I stumbled back, and the door slammed shut. When I looked down, I saw it, a single object lying on the floor where the draft had swept through. A photograph. It was old, faded, the edges curling with age. It showed a family, parents and 2 children, standing in front of a house that looked eerily familiar. My stomach churned as I realized why. It was this house, and the younger of the 2 children was me. But the other child, I didn't recognize her. I stared at the picture for hours, trying to make sense of it. I didn't have a sibling. I was an only child. My mother never mentioned another daughter, and there were no other photos of her anywhere in the house. I searched every room, every drawer, but she didn't exist outside of that single photograph. That night, the dreams came again. This time, I wasn't alone. The other child was there, standing beside me in the attic, her face pale and featureless. Her hand gripped mine, cold and bony, as we both stared at the door. "Open it," she whispered, her voice hollow and distant. "She's waiting." I woke up screaming. The bruises on my wrist were darker now, angrier. They weren't fading. I tried to leave the house that morning, to pack my bags and drive back to my apartment in the city, but my car wouldn't start. My phone had no signal. Even the landline in the kitchen, a relic from the 90s, was dead. I was trapped. By nightfall, the door was calling to me. I don't mean that metaphorically. I could hear it whispering my name, soft and insistent. The voice was familiar, my mother's. "Anna," it cooed. "Come here. I need you." My legs moved on their own. I climbed the attic stairs, my hands trembling as I reached for the knob. The door opened before I touched it, swinging inward to reveal nothing but darkness. But it wasn't empty. Something was in there waiting. I don't remember much after that. Just fragments. The smell of lavender. The feeling of cold fingers brushing my cheek. And the words spoken in that garbled, too deep voice. "You belong to us now." I woke up this morning in the attic, lying on the floor. The door was gone. The wall where it had been was smooth, unbroken, as if it had never existed. But the photograph was still there, clutched in my hand. The girl's face wasn't blank anymore. It was mine. Let's start a new story. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a strip mall, halfway through a soggy fast food burger, when my phone buzzed. The number was unlisted, the message stark. Confused, I glanced around, but the lot was mostly empty. Just a couple of cars parked far off, their windows reflecting the dull gray sky. No one nearby. I typed back a quick response. "Sorry, I think you've got the wrong number." Almost immediately, another message came through. "No mistake." Looked down. I froze, my stomach flipping. Slowly, I leaned forward and looked out the driver's side window. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, just below the edge of my car door, something caught my eye, a small, folded piece of paper tucked into the seam of the asphalt. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the lock button. The strip mall felt eerily still, the hum of distant traffic muffled by the thick air. Finally, I cracked the door open and reached down to pick up the paper. It was a cheap business card, frayed at the edges. On one side, there was a single word scrawled in black ink. "Wait." I looked around again, scanning the lot, the storefronts, the empty sidewalk. Nothing. No one. Just the faint buzz of a flickering street light overhead. My phone buzzed again. "You didn't wait." I nearly dropped the card. My pulse hammered in my ears as I locked the doors and threw the car into reverse, backing out of the space so fast I almost clipped the curb. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every passing car felt like it was following me. Every shadow seemed to linger just a moment too long. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the unease had settled deep into my chest. I told myself it was probably a prank, some weirdo with too much time on their hands. I tossed the card into the trash and tried to forget about it. That night, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. The screen lit up with another text. "Check your front porch." My first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity, or maybe fear, got the better of me. Heart pounding, I crept to the front door and peered through the peephole. The porch light cast a pale glow over the steps, but I didn't see anything out of place. Then I spotted it, another folded piece of paper, resting neatly on the doormat. I opened the door just enough to grab it and quickly shut it again, locking the deadbolt behind me. This one wasn't a business card. It was a piece of notebook paper, torn and slightly damp, with a single phrase written in the same spindly handwriting. "You've been chosen." I didn't sleep after that. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, clutching a kitchen knife and jumping at every creak of the floorboards. The next day at work, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was probably just a random coincidence, a harmless prank. But as I sat at my desk, I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the office windows, scanning the parking lot below for any sign of something or someone out of place. Around noon, I went to grab lunch, and when I returned, there was another note on my desk. This one wasn't folded or hidden. It was lying in plain sight on top of my keyboard, as if someone had placed it there just moments before. My coworkers were milling around, laughing, talking, but no one seemed to notice anything unusual. I unfolded the note with trembling hands. Do not involve them. This is between us. I felt sick. How had someone gotten into the office? And why me? I looked around, but everyone seemed normal. If anyone had left the note, they weren't giving themselves away. That night, I barricaded my door and kept the lights on. Around midnight, the text started again. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I didn't respond. The door isn't locked. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the message, my fingers trembling over the screen. The door was locked. I checked it 3 times before going to bed. Before I could think, I grabbed the knife from the counter and tiptoed to the front door. It was still locked. My shaky laugh was cut short when I noticed something small and white poking out from under the doorframe. Another note. I yanked it out, heart racing. This one simply said, "Turn around." I didn't. Instead, I ran out the back door, through the yard, and into my car. I drove aimlessly for hours, stopping only when exhaustion forced me to pull into a gas station parking lot. I didn't go home that night. The next morning, I called the police. They came to the house, took a report, and looked around, but there was no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been inside. They told me it was probably a prank, maybe someone I knew trying to scare me. I didn't go back to work. I didn't sleep in my house again. Instead, I started staying in motels, changing locations every few days. But the notes kept finding me, folded into the pocket of a jacket I hadn't worn in weeks, slipped under my windshield wiper. Once, I found one taped to the inside of a motel bathroom mirror. Each one carried the same message, growing more insistent, more personal. You can't run. You know this is yours to finish. We're waiting. I don't know who he is. I don't know what I've done to deserve this, or why they chose me. But the texts and the notes haven't stopped, and every time I think I'm safe, they remind me that I'm not. Last night, I found a note pinned to the ceiling above my bed in my newest motel. It was different this time, shorter, final. We're here. And then the lights went out. Let's start a new story. I worked in IT, spent most of my days fixing printers and untangling poorly named Excel files. If you'd asked me before that night, I'd have said I was about as ordinary as they come. Boring even. But something changed around 3:13 a.m. on March 7th, and I've been trying to figure out what ever since. It started with the lights. I was up late, scrolling through my phone in the living room, when the power flickered. Not unusual. My apartment complex is old, and the wiring's unreliable. But this was different. The overhead bulb didn't dim or sputter. It pulsed. Once, twice, 3 times, and then it turned blue. I stared at it, my phone forgotten in my lap. The light wasn't just blue. It was vivid, electric, casting long shadows across the room. Everything felt sharper, more real, as if I'd been walking through life half asleep and was only now waking up. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, the light was gone. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of my phone screen. That's when I heard the hum. It was soft at first, like distant machinery, but it grew louder, filling the air around me. It wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling. It was everywhere, a low, resonant vibration that made my teeth ache. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked to the window. Outside, the street looked normal. Cars parked in neat rows, porch lights glowing, the occasional cat slinking through the shadows. But something felt off. The hum was louder now, pressing against my eardrums, and the air seemed denser, like walking through water. And then I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them standing in the middle of the street. They weren't moving, just standing there, their silhouettes perfectly still against the orange glow of the streetlights. They were tall, impossibly tall, their heads almost brushing the streetlights themselves, and their limbs were long and angular, like something stretched too far. I should have called someone. The police, a friend, anyone. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, watching as one of the figures turned its head toward me. I say head, but it didn't have a face, just a blank, smooth surface that seemed to shimmer like liquid. It tilted its head, almost curiously, and then it began to move. Slowly, deliberately, It stepped onto the sidewalk, its impossibly long legs carrying it toward my building. I backed away from the window, my chest tight. My mind was racing, screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my entire body, and I could hear something else now. Whispers, faint and garbled, like a voice played backward. The figure reached the front of my building. I heard the door creak open, heard its footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate. I ran to my bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen glitched, the numbers dissolving into static before the phone shut off entirely. I threw it onto the bed, my breathing shallow, and pressed my ear to the door. The footsteps stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, but the only sound was the hum, low and droning, vibrating through the floor. Then, slowly, the handle began to turn. I stumbled back, my pulse roaring in my ears, as the door creaked open. The figure stood there, its faceless head tilted in that same curious angle. It didn't step inside. It just stood in the doorway, impossibly tall, its elongated fingers curling around the frame. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum. It didn't respond. Instead, it reached out, its hand moving with an unnatural fluidity, and placed its fingers on the wall. The paint bubbled and warped under its touch, spreading outward in ripples, and I realized it wasn't just touching the wall, it was changing it. The hum grew louder, almost unbearable, and the air seemed to ripple like heat haze. I closed my eyes, unable to watch. The sound built to a crescendo, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. The door was shut, the wall untouched, and the room was quiet. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, I crawled into bed, my body trembling, and fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, the world was different. It wasn't obvious at first. My apartment looked the same, my phone worked again, and the sun was shining. But when I stepped outside, I noticed the silence. There were no birds, no distant sounds of traffic, no hum of electricity. Just an eerie, all-encompassing stillness. The people were different too. They moved normally, talked normally, but their eyes seemed hollow, as if something vital had been scooped out and replaced with nothing. They didn't seem to notice me, their gazes sliding past me like I wasn't there. I tried calling my sister, my co-workers, even my landlord. No one picked up. I walked downtown, where the streets were crowded but wrong, like watching a movie where all the extras are just slightly out of sync. The figures from the night before were gone, but their presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. Then I saw it, a flash of blue light, at the edge of my vision. I turned, and there was one of the tall figures standing at the end of the street, watching me. No one else seemed to notice. They walked past it, around it, through it, their hollow eyes fixed on nothing. I ran. I don't know how long I've been running. Days? Weeks? Time feels slippery now, like it's stretched too thin. The figures are everywhere, watching, waiting, their smooth faces unreadable. The hum never stops, growing louder every time I think I've escaped. The world didn't end in fire or flood. It ended quietly, replaced by something else, something hollow. I don't know why I'm still here, why they haven't taken me too. Maybe they're waiting. Let's start a new story. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was standing in the cereal aisle of a grocery store. I'd gone in for milk and maybe some frozen pizza, the usual midweek survival run, but something made me stop. I was staring at the shelves, not at the endless rows of cartoon mascots and bright colors, but at the people. Every single person in that aisle was motionless, not casually pausing, not browsing, they were still. A woman with a hand halfway to a box of Cheerios. A man crouched as if reaching for something on a lower shelf. A child frozen mid-sprint with his mouth open in a silent laugh. No one blinked. No one moved. At first, I thought it was a prank, maybe a flash mob or some weird TikTok challenge I didn't understand. But then I noticed the air. It felt thick, like breathing through syrup. And the hum of the store, the beeping registers, the faint muzak was gone, replaced by silence. Total, oppressive silence. "Hello," I said, my voice breaking the quiet like a rock thrown into still water. Every head turned to me, not all at once, but in a slow, unnatural ripple, like their movements had to sync up with some invisible mechanism. I don't know why I ran, but I did. Milk and pizza forgotten, I bolted out of the store, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back until I was outside, leaning against my car and gasping for air. The store seemed normal again, bustling with life. I could hear the faint echo of someone announcing a sale on deli meats over the intercom. Maybe it had just been my imagination. Stress, exhaustion, something. That's what I told myself. I didn't go back to that store for weeks. I started driving an extra 15 minutes to another one across town just in case. Things seemed fine after that. Normal even until the second time. I was waiting for a train, earbuds in, scrolling through my phone. It was late, the platform mostly empty. A few other people stood around, business types with briefcases, a couple of teenagers in hoodies, a man holding a bouquet of flowers. I was lost in my music when I felt it, that same heaviness in the air, like the world was pressing down on me. I looked up, and there it was again, stillness. Every single person on the platform was frozen. A man's tie hung mid-sway, defying gravity. A pigeon hovered above the ground, wings caught mid-flap. The train's headlights were visible in the distance, but it didn't move, stuck like a paused video. "Not again," I muttered, my pulse quickening. This time, though, I didn't call out. I didn't wait for them to turn. I just stood there, clutching my phone, trying to will myself to wake up from whatever this was. And then the man with the flowers moved. It wasn't the slow, rippling motion from before. He moved like a person, sudden, fluid, purposeful. He turned toward me, his face obscured by shadows cast by the platform lights, and began walking in my direction. The bouquet in his hand trailed petals with each step, leaving a line of color on the ground. "Do you feel it yet?" he asked. "Feel what?" My voice cracked as I took a step back, nearly tripping over the edge of the platform. The train still hadn't moved. The headlights burned in the same spot, casting long shadows that didn't seem to match the angles of anything. "The edges," he said, stopping a few feet from me, where the world frays. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them, boring into me. His voice was calm, almost friendly, but it carried an undertone of something sharp, something dangerous. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered. "Yes, you do." He extended the bouquet toward me. The flowers weren't flowers anymore. They were made of paper, newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, some of them blank. "You're starting to see, aren't you? The cracks." "I don't want to see anything," I said, my voice shaking. "Too late." He smiled, a quick, flickering thing that didn't touch the rest of his face. "It's always too late." The platform lights flickered, and when they came back on, he was gone. The train roared into motion, blurring past me in a rush of sound and wind. The world snapped back to normal like nothing had happened. But I couldn't unsee it, the cracks he mentioned. They were everywhere. A billboard on my drive home flickered, not with static, but with images that didn't make sense. A house I didn't recognize. A close-up of someone's eye. The words "hello" again flashing in jagged letters before it returned to an ad for car insurance. At home, my phone glitched, replacing my lock screen with a photo of the bouquet, made of paper flowers. And the people, my co-workers, my neighbors, even strangers in the street, started acting wrong. Not all the time, but enough. A man on the bus turned his head too far, like his neck didn't have the normal limits. A co-worker laughed at a joke I hadn't made yet. My upstairs neighbor knocked on my door, just once at exactly 3:33 every morning, without fail. I tried ignoring it, pretending it wasn't happening. But the cracks kept widening. The edges kept fraying. And the man with the bouquet kept appearing, always in the corner of my eye, just out of reach. Last night, I woke up to find the bouquet on my pillow. The petals were gone, replaced by pages ripped from books I'd never read, newspapers with dates that didn't exist. One of the pages had a single sentence written in bold, black ink. "Come find us before they do." I don't know who they are. I don't know who us is. But I think the man with the flowers was right. The world is fraying, and I'm starting to slip through the cracks. Let's start a new story. The clock in the hospital waiting room ticked with a mechanical indifference, its hands creeping forward as if mocking my urgency. I'd been here for hours, sitting in one of those stiff, vinyl-covered chairs that make you regret every choice that led to this moment. The air smelled like disinfectant and faded hope. Outside, the rain hit the windows in steady, accusing rhythms. I shouldn't have come. Not here. Not back. The nurse called my name, her voice cutting through the low hum of the fluorescent lights. I looked up, trying to decide if I'd imagined it. She didn't smile, just stood there, clipboard in hand, waiting. Right. I mumbled, getting to my feet. My legs felt like they didn't belong to me. She led me down a hallway that seemed longer than it should have been, the kind of hallway that stretched in dreams or nightmares. Every door we passed had a number, but no windows. I caught my reflection in one of the glossy walls, pale, gaunt, with shadows under my eyes that looked painted on. I didn't look like myself. Not anymore. You'll be in here, the nurse said, stopping at a door marked 113. She didn't meet my eyes as she opened it. The room was empty, except for the bed and the machine next to it, humming faintly. A curtain was drawn around the far side, blocking my view of whatever or whoever was behind it. The nurse left without a word, the door clicking shut behind her. I stood there for a moment, frozen. Then I stepped forward and pulled the curtain aside. It was me, not a reflection, not some trick of the light. Me, lying there, hooked up to the machine, my chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. My face was waxy and still, like a mannequin's, except for the faint twitch of my eyelids. What the? I started, but my voice trailed off. I backed away, my heart pounding, and bumped into the chair behind me. The door opened again. A man stepped in, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that was too crisp, too perfect. He had no clipboard, no badge, nothing that said he belonged in a hospital. "Hello," he said, his voice smooth and measured. He didn't seem surprised to find me there. "Who are you?" I demanded. "What is this?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to the bed, looking down at the version of me lying there like he was studying a work of art. "This is your second chance," he said finally, turning to face me. His eyes were a shade of gray that seemed to shift in the light. "Or your undoing. It depends on what you choose." "Second chance? At what?" I was angry now, the kind of anger that hides fear. "What's going on? Who are you?" He tilted his head slightly, as if deciding how much to tell me. "Call me an opportunity, or a consequence, whichever makes you feel better." I stared at him, my chest tightening. "You're not making any sense." He gestured toward the bed. "This isn't the first time you've been here. The details change, of course, different roads, different choices, but the result is always the same. You end up here, in this room, facing yourself. I don't understand. You're not meant to. Not fully. Not yet." He paused, his expression softening, almost pitying. "You've been circling this moment for longer than you know. And now, you have a choice." "What choice?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He stepped closer, his presence filling the room like a shadow that had grown too large. "You can walk out of this hospital and continue as you are, knowing nothing will change. Or you can wake up," he said, gesturing to the bed. "And remember." "Remember what?" My head was spinning, the room tilting slightly, as if the air had thickened. He smiled faintly. "Everything." I looked at the me in the bed, so still, so fragile. My mind raced with questions, fears, possibilities. What was waiting for me if I woke up? What would I lose if I didn't? What happens if I leave? I asked, my voice trembling. "Then this version of you fades," he said simply. "And you go back to living the life you think you want. The life you've always known. And if I wake up," his gaze darkened, "you'll see the truth." I didn't like the way he said it. Like the truth was something sharp and dangerous. But I couldn't ignore the pull, the gnawing sense that I was teetering on the edge of something I was meant to find. "What's the truth?" I asked, stepping toward the bed. "Truth is a door," he said, his voice quieter now. "And once you open it, there's no going back." I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the edge of the mattress. My other self looked so small, so lifeless. But the faint rise and fall of my chest was steady, almost rhythmic, as if waiting. I turned to the man. If I wake up, do I die? He shook his head slowly. Not in the way you think. The words chilled me, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached out, my hand brushing against the hand of the me in the bed. The moment our skin touched, a shock ran through me, and the world tilted violently. I gasped, sitting up in the hospital bed, the machine next to me blaring a sharp, urgent beep. My skin was clammy, my breath ragged. The room was empty now, the man in the suit gone. But I wasn't alone. The walls of the room seemed to pulse, faint and slow, like a heartbeat. And in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, something moved. A shape, watching, waiting. I remembered everything. And I understood, finally, what the man in the suit had meant. Truth wasn't freedom. Truth was the beginning of the end. Let's start a new story. It was one of those giant roadside signs you see on highways, sandwiched between fast food ads and injury lawyer slogans. This one was starkly simple. A white background, bold black text that read, "Have you seen her?" Below the text was a photo of a young woman, mid-20s maybe, with dark eyes and a hesitant smile. No name, no details, no number to call. Just a question. I don't know why it stuck with me. Maybe it was the way her eyes seemed to follow me as I drove past. Or maybe it was the sheer lack of context. It felt wrong, unfinished. I told myself it was probably some viral marketing stunt. One of those campaigns designed to make you curious enough to look it up online. I didn't give it another thought. At least, not until the next morning. The billboard had changed. The text now read, "She was here." Same photo, same unsettling gaze, but the words felt heavier, more urgent. I slowed as I passed it, unease creeping up my spine. Had I misread it the day before? No, I was sure it said, "Have you seen her?" I even remembered repeating the question to myself in the car. I shrugged it off. Maybe I'd imagined the change, or maybe it was part of the campaign. It didn't matter. I had a busy day ahead, and I wasn't going to let a billboard derail it. But the next day it changed again. She's waiting. This time I pulled over. The highway hummed with the rush of passing cars as I stared up at the sign. The words felt personal now, like they were meant for me. The woman's eyes seemed sharper, almost accusing. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a pull, like the message demanded something from me. I pulled out my phone to snap a picture, but as I focused the camera, the screen froze. No matter how many times I tapped, the photo wouldn't save. I tried again and again, growing increasingly frustrated until I noticed something on the edge of the screen. A shadow, faint but distinct, seemed to hover near the bottom corner of the photo. I glanced up at the billboard, but nothing was there. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was she? What did the messages mean? I tried searching online for missing persons reports, viral marketing campaigns, anything that might explain it, but I came up empty. The billboard wasn't listed on any advertising sites, and no one else seemed to be talking about it. The next morning, the text had changed yet again. She's closer. By now, the unease had turned into outright dread. The air around the billboard felt heavier as I passed it, like it was pressing down on me. Her eyes seemed sharper still, more alive. I swore her expression had shifted slightly, her mouth curving upward in the faintest suggestion of a smirk. I didn't stop this time. I couldn't. Something about the sign felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, as if acknowledging it any further would make it worse. That night, I woke to a sound in my apartment, a faint tapping coming from the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was no fire escape outside my window, no way for anyone to be there. But the tapping continued, soft and deliberate, like fingers against the glass. Gathering what little courage I had, I crept to the window and pulled back the curtain. Nothing, just the empty street below, dimly lit by the glow of a street lamp. I let out a shaky breath, feeling equal parts relief and foolishness. But as I turned away, I caught it, a fleeting reflection in the glass. Her. I spun back to the window, my heart hammering in my chest, but she was gone. The street was as empty as before. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I called out of work. I couldn't bring myself to drive past the billboard again. Couldn't bear to see how it had changed. But staying home offered no comfort. The air in my apartment felt wrong, charged like static electricity before a storm. That evening, I finally ventured out, unable to sit with the suffocating tension any longer. The streets were unusually quiet as I drove, the city seeming darker than it should have been. I avoided the highway, taking back roads instead, but somehow, impossibly, I ended up back at the billboard. I didn't even realize I'd turned onto the highway until I saw it looming ahead. The message had changed again, and this time it made my blood run cold. "She's here." I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a halt on the shoulder. My hands were trembling as I stared up at the sign. Her face was different now, smiling widely, unnaturally. Her eyes seemed to burn with something cruel, something knowing, and then the lights on the billboard flickered. For a brief moment, the entire sign went dark, plunging the highway into eerie shadow. When the lights came back on, the photo was gone. So was the message. The billboard was blank, nothing but a white expanse. I barely made it home that night, my thoughts a chaotic blur of fear and confusion. When I finally collapsed into bed, I told myself it was over. Whatever had happened, whatever I'd seen, it was done now. But at 3:13 a.m., I woke to a whisper. It came from the corner of the room, soft but unmistakable. "Have you seen me?" I didn't move. I couldn't. My eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling as the voice came again, closer this time. "Have you seen me?" Something shifted at the edge of my vision, and my breath hitched. Slowly, unwillingly, I turned my head. She was standing there, inches from my bed, her smile stretching far too wide. The last thing I remember is her hand reaching for me, her fingers impossibly long, her nails black as midnight. I woke up the next morning on the side of the highway, parked just beneath the billboard. The message was back, the letters stark against the white backdrop. "They've seen you." Her face was gone. Mine was there instead. Let's start a new story. Not a seasonal chill, or the kind you notice when the heater falters on a winter night, but a deep, biting cold that settled into my apartment like a parasite. It began in the corner of my living room, a single spot where the temperature plummeted even when the thermostat read 70 degrees. I thought it was a draft at first, or maybe a problem with the insulation. But no matter how many times I checked, there was no reason for it. The cold spread slowly. By the third day, it had crept halfway across the room, leaving an icy trail on the floor. I could feel it in my bones when I walked past, as if the heat of my body was being sucked away. My cat, Murphy, avoided the area entirely, his ears flattening against his head whenever he got too close. By the end of the week, the cold had swallowed the entire living room. The air shimmered faintly, like heat waves rising off asphalt, only backwards, frigid and wrong. I started to notice other things, too. Small things. The way the shadows seemed darker in that room. How the light from the lamps didn't quite reach the corners anymore. The faint hum of my refrigerator seemed muffled, as though the cold were devouring sound itself. And then there was the smell. It wasn't obvious at first, just a faint metallic tang that reminded me of old pennies. But as the days passed, it grew stronger, sharper, until it burned my nostrils. It was the smell of something ancient and decayed, like the world had opened up and bled out into my apartment. I called maintenance. The guy who came up was young, maybe 25, and reeked of cigarette smoke. I watched as he stood in the living room, shivering despite his heavy jacket. "Yeah," he said finally, rubbing the back of his neck. "No idea. Probably a vent issue or something. I'll send someone up." No one came. By the second week, the cold had spread to the rest of the apartment. I started keeping Murphy locked in the bedroom, the only place still warm, but even there, the chill was beginning to seep under the door. My skin felt raw all the time, as if the cold were gnawing at me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus. Then the knocking started. It came from the far wall of the living room, where the cold had first appeared. A soft, rhythmic tap-tap-tap, like knuckles brushing against plaster. It always happened late at night, just as I was about to drift off. The sound was deliberate, patient, as if whatever was making it knew I was listening. I told myself it was the pipes, that it was the building settling. that it was anything other than what I felt deep down, a presence. Something that had been watching me from the moment the cold arrived. The knocking grew louder over the next few nights, until it was almost deafening. It followed me now, echoing from the walls no matter where I went. I tried to ignore it, but it was everywhere, filling my ears until I thought I'd go mad. And then one night it stopped. I didn't notice at first. It wasn't until I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, that I realized the apartment had gone utterly silent. No knocking, no hum of the fridge, not even the faint creak of the floorboards. The quiet was worse. I sat up, straining to hear, but the silence was oppressive, swallowing every sound I made. My breath clouded in front of me, the cold more intense than ever. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to ripple. That's when I heard it. Not a knock this time, but a voice. Soft and low, so faint I could barely make it out. "Found you." I froze, every muscle in my body screaming to run, but I couldn't move. The voice came again, closer now, slipping through the silence like a knife. "Come closer." I turned toward the sound, and my flashlight beam fell on the wall. The plaster was buckling, a faint bulge pressing outward, as if something were trying to push through. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface, and that metallic smell filled the air again, sharp and nauseating. The wall groaned, the bulge growing larger, and I realized with sickening clarity that something was on the other side. The cracks widened, and a sliver of darkness appeared, impossibly black against the pale plaster. It wasn't a hole. It was more like a tear, a gash that seemed to bleed cold and shadow. The voice spilled out from it, louder now, urgent and eager. "Let me in," I screamed. I don't remember much after that. Just running. Murphy clutched against my chest, my bare feet slamming against the icy floor. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from the building. I never went back, but the cold followed me. At first, it was subtle, a chill in the air when there shouldn't have been, the faint scent of metal. Then, the knocking began again, soft but insistent, tapping against the walls of my new apartment. Last night, I woke to find the shadows rippling in the corner of my bedroom. And this morning, there was a crack in the wall. Let's start a new story. There's a stretch of road in the middle of nowhere called Old Shale Highway. It's not on most maps, just one of those forgotten back roads people rarely take unless they're lost or in a hurry to shave 10 minutes off a long trip. I knew about it because of my older brother Jake, who swore up and down it was the quickest way to the cabin we were headed to that weekend. The cabin was supposed to be our getaway, just the two of us catching up after years of drifting apart. He brought the beer, I'd brought the snacks, and we planned to spend the weekend fishing and playing cards. The perfect sibling reunion. But as we turned onto Old Shale Highway that evening, something about the air felt wrong, like we'd passed through some invisible curtain into a place we weren't supposed to be. The road was narrow, flanked by thick trees that rose like walls on either side. The headlights barely illuminated 10 feet ahead, and the farther we drove, the more oppressive the darkness became. The trees seemed closer now, their gnarled branches clawing toward the car like skeletal fingers. Jake laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Creepy, huh? Bet this road's seen its fair share of ghost stories." I forced a chuckle, but my stomach churned. Something about the way the headlights reflected off the road. It looked wet, but it hadn't rained in days. "Keep an eye out for deer," I said, more to have something to say than out of real concern. We drove for miles without seeing another car, house, or sign of life. Just the endless stretch of blacktop disappearing into the void. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine, broken occasionally by Jake tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. Then the first sign appeared. It was a wooden post on the side of the road with a hand-painted sign nailed to it. The letters were crude and uneven, but we both read it out loud at the same time. "Turn back." Jake laughed again, louder this time. "Seriously? What is this, a horror movie?" I didn't laugh. "Maybe it's a prank. Some local kids messing around." "Yeah, probably," he said, but his voice had lost its bravado. We kept driving. Another mile down, there was another sign. This one was bigger, painted in bold red letters that dripped down the wood like blood. Not safe. Turn around. Jake slowed the car, his fingers tightening on the wheel. You want to go back? He asked, his voice unusually soft. Let's just keep going, I said, though I didn't know why. Something inside me, a small, irrational part of my brain, was curious. Or maybe it was pride. I didn't want to be the one to suggest we bail. The third sign stopped us in our tracks. It was planted in the middle of the road, so large that Jake had to swerve slightly to avoid hitting it. This one wasn't painted. It was burned into the wood, the edges blackened and curling. They will come for you. Jake swore under his breath. Okay, this is getting weird. He reached for his phone to check the map, but the screen was blank. No signal, no GPS. Just a little spinning icon where the map should have been. Do we keep going? I asked, already knowing his answer. We're already halfway through, he said, his voice tense. Might as well finish the drive. The forest around us seemed darker now, the trees denser, pressing closer to the road. I rolled down my window to get some air, but the smell that hit me made my stomach turn. It was metallic and sharp, like rust mixed with decaying leaves. That's when we saw the first figure. It was standing on the shoulder of the road, just within the beam of the headlights. A man, or at least the shape of a man, dressed in dark, tattered clothes. His head was bowed, his face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move as we approached, didn't even flinch when the headlights swept over him. Holy, did you see that? Jake said, his voice cracking slightly. I nodded, my mouth dry. Just keep driving. As we passed him, I couldn't stop myself from looking back. He hadn't moved, but there was something about the way he stood, too rigid, too still, that made my skin crawl. Another mile, another figure. This one was crouched by the side of the road, its arms wrapped around its knees. It was smaller, like a child, but its proportions were wrong. Too long in some places, too short in others. Its head snapped up as we drove past, and for a brief, horrifying second, I thought I saw its face. Its eyes were black, not just dark, completely black like bottomless pits, and its mouth was stretched into a grin so wide it looked painful. Jake hit the gas, and the car lurched forward. Tell me you saw that, he said, his knuckles white on the wheel. I saw it. I whispered. What the hell is this place? We didn't talk after that. We just drove, faster now, the engine whining as Jake pushed it to its limit. More figures appeared along the road, scattered like grotesque mile markers. Some stood, some sat, some crawled, their twisted shapes flickering in and out of the headlights like a strobe light nightmare. Then the car stopped. It didn't sputter, didn't slow down. It just died. The headlights went out, the engine silenced, and we were plunged into darkness, so complete it felt like we'd been swallowed. Jake cursed, turning the key in the ignition again and again, but the car wouldn't start. The only sound was our breathing, fast and shallow. Then came the knocking. It started on my side of the car, a single deliberate knock on the window. Then on Jake's side. Then from the roof. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't dare look. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Don't open the door, Jake whispered, as if I needed the reminder. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then, in the darkness ahead, a pair of headlights flickered to life. They weren't ours. They were too high up, too bright, like the eyes of something massive staring us down. The knocking started again, louder this time, shaking the car. We didn't stay to find out what happened next. Jake grabbed my arm, and we bolted from the car, running blindly into the forest. The last thing I remember hearing was the screech of metal and the sound of something dragging the car away. We never found the cabin. An old shale highway? It doesn't show up on any map. Let's start a new story. Erin had begged me to pick up an antique desk she'd bought from some estate sale across town. Please, Nate, she'd said, batting her eyes over FaceTime. I can't get it in my car, and the guy says he's moving out tomorrow. I sighed, but I owed her. She'd bailed me out of more than one jam in my life. Fine, I said. Text me the address. The place turned out to be in one of those weird suburban developments where all the streets are circles and the houses look like they were built with Monopoly pieces. The house itself was drab, and unassuming, with peeling beige paint and a small, overgrown yard. It didn't strike me as the kind of place where you'd find an antique anything. A wiry old man answered the door, his watery eyes narrowing as he looked me up and down. "You're here for the desk," he said, not a question. His voice was gravelly, like he'd spent a lifetime smoking unfiltered cigarettes. He stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. The house was cluttered but clean, filled with mismatched furniture and faded rugs. The desk was in the corner of the living room, half covered in newspapers and stacks of yellowed envelopes. It was a beautiful piece, I'll admit, rich, dark wood with delicate carvings along the edges. But something about it felt off. The air around it seemed heavier, almost suffocating, as if the object itself took up more space than it should. "How much did she pay for this?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The old man shrugged. "Not enough." He let out a dry laugh. "But it's not about the money. I just needed it gone." I nodded, not really listening. I was more focused on how heavy the desk looked. The thing had to weigh a ton. "Can you give me a hand getting it into my truck?" The old man's expression changed. For a split second, I thought I saw fear flash across his face, but it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure. "I don't touch it," he muttered, turning away. "Not anymore." I laughed nervously, waiting for him to say he was joking, but he didn't. Instead, he shuffled toward the kitchen, mumbling something about a dolly in the garage. Left alone, I approached the desk, running my hand along its smooth surface. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, like it had been sitting in a freezer. I leaned down to check if the drawers were empty, figuring it'd be easier to carry without the extra weight. The top drawer slid open smoothly, revealing a neat stack of old photographs. Black and white, sepia-toned, the kind you'd expect to find in someone's attic. Except these weren't normal photographs. Each one showed the same man, always standing in the background, always partially obscured. Sometimes he was behind a group of laughing children, his face just barely visible in the shadow of a tree. Other times, he was at the edge of a crowd, his features blurred as if he'd moved while the photo was taken. But what sent a chill down my spine was that in every single picture, he was staring directly at the camera. I flipped through them quickly, my unease growing with each one. In the last photo, the man wasn't obscured at all. He stood front and center, his face sharp and clear. It was gaunt and hollow, his eyes too deep set, his mouth stretched into something that might have been a smile if it weren't so wrong. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place where I'd seen him before. "Got the dolly," the old man barked, startling me. I shoved the photos back into the drawer and slammed it shut, my heart racing. He didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't care. Together, we wrestled the desk onto the dolly and out to my truck. The whole time, I felt like the old man was watching me too closely, his gaze lingering every time I touched the desk. When we finally secured it, he clapped me on the shoulder with a hand that was colder than it should have been. "Take care of yourself," he said, his tone almost pitying. Then he turned and shuffled back inside without another word. The drive home was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see someone sitting in the bed of the truck. By the time I got to Erin's, my nerves were shot. She was thrilled with the desk, of course. "It's perfect," she squealed, running her hands over the carvings. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." I told her about the photos, but she just laughed. "You're such a chicken, Nate. It's just an old desk. Probably some family heirloom or something." I left soon after, eager to be away from the thing. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man from the photographs. His too thin face, his hollow eyes, the way he seemed to be staring at me through the lens. The next day, Erin called. "Did you go through the desk?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What? No," I said. "I just told you about the pictures." Her breath hitched on the other end. "They're gone." I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. "What do you mean gone?" "The photos. They're not in the drawer anymore." My stomach dropped. "Maybe you misplaced them." I offered weakly, though I knew she hadn't. "I didn't. But that's not the worst part." She paused, her voice barely a whisper. "Last night, I swear I saw someone standing at the foot of my bed. Call the police, I said immediately. I'm coming over. When I got to her place, the desk was still there, as pristine as ever. Erin was pale and jittery, clutching a mug of coffee like it was the only thing grounding her. She insisted we get rid of the desk, so we loaded it back into my truck and drove to the nearest donation center. But when we got there, the desk wouldn't come out. I don't mean it was heavy. I mean it wouldn't move. It was as if it had fused to the truck bed, the wood gripping the metal like roots sinking into soil. Erin started crying, and I nearly broke my hand trying to pry it loose. Finally, I drove it back to the old man's house, but the place was empty. A for sale sign was stuck in the front yard, the windows dark and lifeless. I left the desk in the driveway and sped off, heart pounding. That night, I woke to the sound of tapping at my window. When I finally worked up the courage to look, I saw him, the man from the photos, standing in the street, staring up at me, his too thin face illuminated by the streetlight. His mouth stretched into that same impossible smile. The desk was back in my truck the next morning, and now every time I try to get rid of it, the man comes closer. Let's start a new story. It began with an unopened can of ginger ale on the passenger seat. I noticed it one morning as I climbed into our shared car, groggy and late for work. Maya didn't drink ginger ale. She called it soda in denial. But there it was, sitting upright in the cup holder, not mine and definitely not hers. I asked her about it that evening, offhandedly. Maybe I grabbed it by accident when I was at the gas station, she said with a casual shrug. You know how they stick them by the register. She was always good at explaining things. Smooth, believable, never missing a beat. It wasn't the ginger ale itself that lingered with me. It was the ease with which she dismissed it, like the lie had been waiting, rehearsed and polished, for me to ask. Then there was the pen. An ordinary, cheap ballpoint with the name of a local accounting firm printed on the side. It rolled out from under the couch one night while I was vacuuming. I don't know why I noticed it. It wasn't unusual to find random junk in our apartment, but something about it stuck. Maya hated branded pens. She called them corporate propaganda, a hill she was weirdly willing to die on. I asked her where it came from. Oh, must have been one of my co-workers, she said, barely looking up from her book. Maybe he left it when he dropped off those files last week. Another seamless explanation. But there was no he at her office, not among the colleagues she usually talked about. By now, these little mysteries were beginning to form a pattern, like clues scattered through the pages of a bad detective novel. I started to notice more. The subtle shift in her scent, still her favorite vanilla lotion, but with something unfamiliar layered beneath, sharp and woody. Her sudden insistence on walking to the corner store for fresh air, something she'd never cared about before. The way she'd come back smiling, almost glowing, as though the errand had been a secret victory. The final breadcrumb came in the form of an orange scarf, left draped over the back of her chair at the dining table. It wasn't hers. Maya hated orange, called it pumpkin vomit, and I'd never seen her wear anything remotely close to that shade. I touched it absent-mindedly one morning, running the soft fabric through my fingers as I drank my coffee. Is this new? I asked. Her response was too quick, too rehearsed. Oh yeah, I picked it up last week. It was on sale. She smiled a little too brightly. The smile didn't reach her eyes. That's when I knew. I started paying closer attention. Not snooping exactly, but observing. Her phone, once an open book, was now glued to her side. She'd laugh at texts and quickly lock the screen when I glanced her way. Her evenings stretched longer, filled with extra hours at work and catching up with friends. And then there were the silences, those heavy, loaded pauses that filled the space between us like a tangible thing. One Thursday evening, I came home earlier than usual. Maya wasn't expecting me, and the apartment was eerily quiet. Her laptop sat open on the coffee table, the screen glowing faintly. I wouldn't have touched it, didn't want to be that person, but an email notification popped up just as I walked by. Meet at the usual spot. Can't wait to see you. K. A name I didn't know. I stared at the screen, the words burning into my brain, and my stomach churned with a mix of dread and anger. I didn't open the email. I didn't need to. The words said enough. Maya came home an hour later carrying takeout. She smiled when she saw me, but her smile faltered when she noticed the tension in my posture. "Hey," she said, setting the bags down. "You're home early. Everything okay?" I wanted to confront her then, to lay it all out and demand answers. But I couldn't. Instead, I just nodded. Yeah, just tired. That night, I pretended to sleep while she scrolled through her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. I could feel the distance between us, growing wider with every tap. The next morning, I made up an excuse to work late. Instead, I parked outside her office and waited. She left at 5:15, her bag slung over one shoulder, her expression light, almost carefree. But she didn't go home. She didn't go to the grocery store or to meet a friend. She drove to a small cafe on the other side of town, one we'd never been to together. And there he was, Kay, tall, with an easy smile and an air of familiarity that hit me like a punch to the gut. They hugged, too long for acquaintances, too intimate for coworkers, and sat down at a corner table. They didn't notice me watching from my car, parked just far enough away to go unnoticed. They laughed. She leaned forward, her hand brushing his as he spoke. It was a version of Maya I hadn't seen in months, vibrant, alive, glowing. And in that moment, I realized the truth. Whatever we had, whatever connection we once shared, it was gone. She wasn't hiding it from me because she was ashamed. She was hiding it because she didn't care enough to end it properly. I didn't confront her that night. I drove home, sat in the dark for hours, and packed a bag. When she came home, she looked surprised to see me sitting by the door. "Going somewhere?" she asked, her voice light but cautious. "Yeah," I said, standing and picking up the bag. "I think I am." Her smile faltered. "What's going on?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked past her, out into the crisp night air, and let the door close behind me. Some truths don't need words. Some endings write themselves.